November 13th, 1989. A classroom in Indianapolis. A teacher named George is grading papers, moving through them the way he does every Monday, red pen in hand. A reporter walks in. George barely looks up. He's thinking about one paper in particular, a student who usually gets an A, but not this time. He's already planning what he'll say to her about it. Then the reporter says 4 words that stop him completely. It's a homicide. George would later say the first thing that crossed his mind was suicide. Because that's usually what it is, when a 16-year-old doesn't come to school and word starts moving through the halls before anyone official says anything. He remembers thinking, almost involuntarily, well, she didn't get an A from me this time, she got a B. As if the grade still mattered. As if there was still a version of that morning where it did. There wasn't. The name moving through that school that day was Amy Widener. 16 years old. An honor student at Howe High School. The kind of student teachers remembered even years later. Sharp, dependable. The one who kept things organized. She was also a mother. She had a young daughter. And on this particular Monday, Amy wasn't feeling well. So she stayed home from school to take care of her while the rest of the family went about their day. Her older brother, John Paul, 1 year ahead of her. Her younger sister, Tanya, 1 year behind. Her youngest sister, Cassie, just 12 at the time. All of them left the house that morning like it was any other day. None of them knew it would be the last time the house looked the way it had always looked. Sometime after they left, someone came in through the back door. Police would later believe it had been left unlocked, the kind of small, ordinary detail that exists in 1,000 households on 1,000 mornings without consequence. Not this time. Whoever came through that door wasn't expecting anyone to be home. The house was supposed to be empty. Amy wasn't supposed to be there. She was. When her family returned home that day, they found her. One of the first officers on the scene, Captain Jack Gowker, would describe it decades later in a way that still carried weight in his voice. She had lacerations to her head. She was unclothed. It was, in his words, a scene you don't forget. Amy Widener had been beaten. She had been sexually assaulted. And she had been strangled to death inside her own home on a Monday morning that started like any other. If a story like this one that takes decades to find its answer is the kind of case you want to follow all the way to the end, this is the moment to hit subscribe. Not later, not after you've decided whether you trust where this is going. Right now, before the story pulls you any further in. It costs you nothing, and it means you won't miss what happens next. Investigators moved quickly at first, the way they always do in the earliest hours. They noticed a few things missing from the house. A stereo equalizer that belonged to John Paul. Some cash. On the surface, it looked like exactly what it appeared to be, a robbery that had gone wrong. Someone breaks in expecting an empty house, gets caught in the act, and panics. But panic doesn't explain everything about what was left behind in that house. And it especially doesn't explain who was never asked a single question. Detectives began working outward from the family, the way any investigation like this starts. They collected hair samples. They took fingerprints from neighbors. They looked hardest at the people closest to John Paul, his friends, the boys who'd been in and out of that house over the years, the ones who knew the family well enough to know things like when the house might be empty on a school day. None of it matched. Not the hair. Not the prints. Every lead traced back to a name that could be cleared, one after another, until there weren't any names left to check. The case did not get solved that year. It did not get solved the next year, or the year after that. Investigators moved on to other cases, the way departments have to. Files got boxed. Detectives retired. Amy Widener's murder became one of those cases that everyone in the department knew about, and no one had an answer for. Her mother, Gloria, kept living in a world that had stopped making sense on a Monday in November. Her siblings grew up around an absence that never resolved into anything. No name, no face, no explanation. Just a house that had been broken into by someone who was never found. For 22 years, that was where the story stayed. Somewhere in that gap of time, a friend of the family who had lived across the street from the Wideners once mentioned a name. Just in passing, just one name among many that came up when people talked about who used to be around the house back then. Nobody followed up on it. Not that time. It would take over 2 decades and a detective who wasn't even supposed to be working murder cases before anyone did. The results came back, and there was no ambiguity in them. The bloody palm print lifted from Amy Widener's bedroom wall in November of 1989 matched the booking print taken from Rodney Dank in 1997. 22 years. Countless dead ends. Every friend of John Paul's cleared. Every neighbor questioned. Every lead traced back to nothing, and the answer had been sitting in a filing system the entire time, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Detective Carter didn't work this alone from here. He brought in Sergeant David Ellison, and together they began building the case that would need to hold up in a courtroom, not just convince a detective who'd been chasing a hunch. Every piece had to be re-examined. Every old witness statement had to be checked against what they now knew. This wasn't about proving Denk was involved anymore. It was about proving, beyond any doubt, that he was the one who did it. But knowing who did it and finding him were two different problems. Rodney Denk had vanished the moment police tried to talk to him the first time, and there was no reason to think he'd make it easy the second time either. Investigators worked to track his movements, piecing together where he'd been and where he might be. It took time. It took patience. But eventually, they located him. In July of 2012, Marion County Prosecutor Terry Curry filed charges against Rodney Denk for the murder of Amy Widener. 23 years after a 16-year-old honors student was found beaten, assaulted, and strangled in her own home, a name finally had a face attached to it. A face that, until a Facebook memorial page and a nuisance abatement officer's curiosity collided in 2011, had never once been questioned by police. Here's a detail worth sitting with for a moment. At the time of Amy's murder, Rodney Denk was 18 years old. Not a stranger who wandered in off the street. Not someone with no connection to the family. He was someone who had spent time in that house. Someone John Paul considered a friend. The person responsible for one of the most painful unsolved cases in Indianapolis wasn't a mystery lurking at the edges of the Wideners' lives. He'd been standing inside their living room. This is the part of the story where we'd usually ask you to like the video or leave a comment, and we still want you to. But if you've made it this far, watching a 22-year-old cold case finally crack open because one detective refused to let a Facebook photo go unexplained, we want to ask for something a little more specific. Helping us keep telling stories like this one isn't complicated. It's subscribing. It's sharing this video with one person who'd sit through all 4 parts the way you just did. That's genuinely how a channel like this keeps finding the next case worth telling. So if this story has held your attention this long, that's the moment to do it. With charges filed, the case moved toward trial. Denk was facing the reality of what 22 years of silence was about to cost him. A courtroom, a jury, and evidence that had been waiting patiently in an evidence locker since the year he turned 18. There's one more thread worth mentioning here, carefully, because it's not something that was ever confirmed. In a later television interview, Denk reportedly suggested that someone else may have been involved that day, an accomplice, someone who was there with him. When pressed for a name, he said he couldn't remember one. No one else was ever charged. No accomplice was ever identified. Whether that claim held any truth to it, or whether it was something else entirely, is something that was never resolved, and it's worth being honest about that rather than pretending the case wrapped up with every question answered. What was resolved, and resolved quickly once the case reached the courts, was Denk's own path forward. Facing physical evidence that placed him at the scene beyond dispute, the question was no longer whether Rodney Denk had killed Amy Widener. It was what he would say when he finally had to answer for it. May 30th, 2013. A courtroom in Marion County. Rodney Denk sat down, picked up a pen, and signed a plea agreement admitting he had killed Amy Widener. Alone. No accomplice this time, despite what he'd suggested in that earlier interview. Just him, admitting to a courtroom what a bloody palm print had already told investigators the year before. According to his own account, the night had started as a robbery. He said he went to the Widener house intending to take the stereo equalizer that belonged to John Paul. He said he believed the house would be empty. And he said that when Amy came around the corner and saw him standing there, something in him reacted in a way he couldn't undo. That's his version. It's worth being honest that it's a version, told by the person with every reason to make sense of what he did, not an independently confirmed sequence of events. What isn't in dispute is what happened to Amy Widener in that house. Beaten, sexually assaulted, strangled. A 16-year-old honors student, homesick with her daughter, dead before her family walked back through the front door. Days after the plea, Denk was sentenced. 50 years for murder. 15 years for rape. 65 years total. He was 40 years old at sentencing, having lived more than double the amount of time Amy ever got, free, for 22 of those years, while her family didn't know his name. For Gloria Widener, Amy's mother, the sentencing didn't erase 24 years of mourning a daughter without knowing why. In interviews after the case closed, she said there wasn't a single day that passed where she didn't think about Amy. She talked about who her daughter might have become, how much Amy loved school, how she always figured her daughter would have ended up a teacher. Her siblings carried it differently. Tanya, only a year younger than Amy. John Paul, a year older, the brother whose friend had done this. Cassie, just 12 when it happened, only remembering fragments of who her older sister had been before that Monday took her. And Amy's daughter, Emily, raised by her grandmother Gloria from that point forward, a granddaughter who became a daughter, a niece who became a sister. Emily later graduated from Purdue University and moved across the country to California, looking, in her own words, for a different set of memories to live inside. None of them ever got to ask Rodney Dank why. Not really. Not in any way that gave them peace instead of just an answer. If this story moved you the way it's supposed to, if you found yourself needing to know how a 22-year-old cold case finally cracked open, that's exactly the kind of story we want to keep telling. And the only way we get to keep doing that is if people like you help carry it forward. Subscribing costs you nothing. Sharing this series with one person costs you nothing. But it's the difference between us finding the next family who's waited decades for someone to say their child's name out loud, and not. As for Dank himself, the sentence he received technically leaves the door open for release one day, though not for a long time. Some sources list his parole eligibility date as January 1st, 2043, when he'd be 72 years old. That's worth stating carefully, because eligibility isn't the same as release, and it's a detail we haven't been able to confirm against official Department of Corrections records. What we can say for certain is this: whatever happens in 2043, it will happen more than half a century after Amy Widener died in her own home at 16 years old. Amy Widener's case took 22 years, a Facebook memorial page, and an officer who wasn't even supposed to be working homicide cases to finally reach an answer. Not every family gets that. Some are still waiting. If there's a case you think deserves that same kind of attention, one that's still cold, still waiting for someone to look twice, tell us in the comments. That's often exactly where the next one we cover comes from. The wind moves through the pines the way it always does at 9,000 feet, thin, sharp, indifferent. Toni Hinthorn steps carefully over loose rock, camera in hand, looking for the shot. Below her, the land falls away into nothing. No trail marker. No guardrail. No one else for miles. Her husband is a few feet behind her. He's the one who brought her here off the marked path, deeper into the backcountry than she's ever gone with him. It's their anniversary, 12 years married, and he told her this spot would be worth it. The view, he said. Wait until you see the view. She lifts the camera. He watches her. And then there is only the sound of the wind. Minutes later, a 911 call goes out from a cell phone with barely enough signal to connect. A man's voice, breathless, describing a fall. His wife, she slipped, he says. She was taking a photo, and she went over. Rescue teams will spend hours reaching the site. When they do, they'll find a woman who fell more than 100 feet down an unmarked cliff face in one of the most remote corners of Rocky Mountain National Park. And they'll find a husband who says he watched it happen and couldn't do a single thing to stop it. That's the story he tells. It is not the story investigators end up believing. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. In today's case, we're covering the death of Dr. Toni Hinthorn, a story that took federal investigators over 2 years to unravel, and that would eventually connect to a second death 17 years earlier that everyone had already agreed was just a tragic accident. Before we go further, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss where this one goes, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Toni Bertolet Hinthorn was 50 years old. She was a respected ophthalmologist, originally from Mississippi, known by colleagues and patients as sharp, warm, and meticulous. She wasn't an experienced hiker. Backcountry trekking wasn't really her thing. But it was September 29, 2012, her wedding anniversary, and her husband, Harold Hinthorn, had planned a hike through Rocky Mountain National Park to celebrate. To everyone who knew them, Harold was a devoted husband. 58 years old, living in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, he described himself as a successful businessman, the kind of person who could afford long vacations, private outings, thoughtful anniversary trips. People believed him. For 20 years, people believed him. The trail Harold chose that day wasn't really a trail at all. It ran along Deer Mountain, in a section of the park with no marked path, poor cell reception, and no nearby ranger station. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you already knew exactly where you were going. And evidence would later show that Harold did know exactly where he was going. Investigators would find that he had been to this specific, obscure location before, more than once. Photographs recovered from the hike itself show the two of them earlier that day. Harold balanced on the rocks near the edge, smiling back at Toni as she took his photo. Another shows the two of them having lunch on the same outcropping, hours before her death. In the investigators' own case file, this spot would later be given a name. They called it the Fall Spot. Why had Harold been there before? What was he doing at an unmarked, hard-to-reach ledge on a mountain his wife had never visited? That question would take federal investigators, National Park Service rangers, and the FBI more than 2 years to answer. And when they finally did, it wouldn't just change how people understood Toni's death. It would reopen a case everyone thought was already closed: the death of another woman, 17 years before, under circumstances that suddenly looked disturbingly familiar. That's next. May of 1995. A stretch of Highway 67, about 10 miles west of a small town called Sedalia, Colorado. A car sits pulled off to the shoulder, and underneath it, working on a flat tire, is a woman named Sandra Lynn Henthorn. Her husband is nearby. There's no one else around for miles. No other cars. No witnesses. Just the two of them, on a quiet stretch of road, doing something as mundane as changing a tire. Something goes wrong. The car comes off the jack, and Lynn Henthorn is crushed beneath it. When authorities investigate, the story they're told is simple and, on its surface, entirely plausible. A jack failure. A tragic, freak accident. Within less than a week, Douglas County officials rule her death exactly that: an accident, nothing more. There's no reason, at the time, to look any harder. Accidents happen. People die in strange, senseless ways every day, and this is filed away as one of them. For 17 years, that's where it stays. Then, in October of 2012, just weeks after Toni Henthorn goes over a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park, investigators quietly reopen the file on Lynn's death. They aren't doing this because of new physical evidence. They're doing it because of a pattern that's suddenly impossible to ignore. 2 wives, 2 remote locations, 2 moments where Harold Henthorn was the only person present when something went fatally wrong. And in both cases, a life insurance policy sitting in the background, timed in a way that raises more questions than it answers. But Lynn's death isn't the only incident investigators start re-examining. There's another one, closer to Toni's death, that starts to look different in hindsight. More than a year before the hike that killed her, Toni and Harold were working together on their mountain cabin. During that work, a 20-foot beam fell and struck Toni, fracturing her vertebrae. At the time, it was treated as exactly what it appeared to be: a construction accident, the kind of thing that happens on any job site when materials aren't secured properly. Prosecutor Sunita Hajra will later stand in front of a jury and describe this incident differently. She'll argue that Harold's account of how the beam fell doesn't hold together, that the explanation he gave doesn't match the physical reality of what would have needed to happen for it to fall the way he described. She frames it not as a random accident, but as a rehearsal, an earlier, failed attempt. Taken individually, none of these incidents proves anything. A tire change gone wrong. A beam that fell during cabin repairs. A hiking trip that ended in tragedy. Each one, on its own, could be exactly what it was called at the time it happened. But prosecutors don't want to present them individually. They want a jury to see all 3 side by side, and they have to convince a judge to let that happen. What follows is a 2-day hearing, one built entirely around a single question. Can evidence of 2 prior incidents be shown to a jury deciding whether Harold Henthorn murdered his second wife? 10 witnesses take the stand. Attorneys enter more than 30 exhibits into the record. Both sides argue their case for hours. The defense argues this is nothing more than an attempt to convict Harold based on character and suspicion, not evidence tied to what happened on that mountain in 2012. Painting him as the kind of man capable of this, they argue, isn't the same as proving he did it. Somewhere in Douglas County, a man named Rishal is watching all of this unfold. He's Lynn's brother. For 17 years, he believed his sister's death was exactly what everyone told him it was: an accident, nothing more. Now, watching investigators lay out a case that connects her death to another woman's murder, he has to sit with the possibility that the answer had been sitting right in front of his family the entire time, and nobody had thought to ask the question. That's the part of this case that should stay with you. Not the courtroom drama, not the forensic details. It's the 17 years. 17 years where a pattern existed and nobody was looking for it, because nobody had any reason to believe there was a pattern at all. That's not a flaw in one investigation. That's how most of these cases stay buried. If something about how long warning signs can sit unnoticed unsettles you, that's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the exact gap our safety guide, invisible until it is not, was built to close. If you've ever wondered how someone gets chosen as a target, this case is a perfect example, and I go even deeper into it in my guide, linked below, or my description. Drop in the comments whether you think you'd have caught it. Would you have noticed the pattern? Or is this only obvious now, looking backward with all the pieces already on the table. The judge has heard both sides. Now there's only one question left. Will the jury ever hear about Lynn Hinthorn at all? Early September 2015. Inside the Alfred J. Arridge United States Courthouse in Denver, about 50 prospective jurors sit waiting as Judge R. Brooke Jackson looks out at them and tells them plainly that the case they're about to hear will be, in his words, a doozy. Half of them have already heard about Harold Hinthorn from the news. 3 are dismissed on the spot, unable to promise they can be impartial. The rest stay, and by the following Tuesday, opening statements begin. For the next several weeks, prosecutors lay out a case built almost entirely on circumstance. There's no confession, no eyewitness besides Harold himself. What there is, instead, is a mountain of documentation. More than 300 exhibits, phone records, photographs, the map with the pink highlighting and the X, testimony from rangers who walked the fall site and called it obscure, testimony about the beam, about Lynn, about insurance policies Tony never knew existed. In her closing argument, prosecutor Sunita Hajra tells the jury that Harold Hinthorn scouted that remote stretch of Deer Mountain roughly 9 times before ever bringing Tony there. She argues he wasn't looking for a scenic view. He was looking for the perfect place to kill someone. Somewhere with no witnesses, no trail, and no chance that anyone could survive a fall from that height. The coroner who examined Tony's body takes the stand as well, and his testimony is its own kind of unsettling. He can't say, definitively, whether she fell or was pushed. There's no physical marker that proves murder beyond doubt. The entire case rests on whether 12 jurors believe that everything surrounding her death, the map, the money, the pattern, the timing adds up to something more than tragic coincidence. On September 21, 2015, after roughly 10.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returns its verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. At sentencing, Harold Hinthorn stands before Judge Jackson and denies it. He says, plainly, that he did not kill Tony. The judge sentences him to life in prison anyway. Hinthorn is eventually transferred to a high-security federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he remains today. He doesn't stop fighting the conviction. Over the following years, Hinthorn takes his case to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that the evidence about Lynn and about the beam should never have been allowed in front of the jury in the first place. The appellate court disagrees, ruling that the evidence was properly admitted because it spoke directly to intent and planning, not just bad character. He takes it to the United States Supreme Court next, asking the nation's highest court to reconsider. The Supreme Court declines. His direct appeals end there. Still, Hinthorn doesn't stop. He later argues, in a separate motion, that his own trial attorney failed him, that the man he paid more than $1 million to defend him was dishonest, and put his own financial interests above Hinthorn's defense. A federal judge hears the claim and rejects it, finding that his representation at trial was constitutionally sound. Every avenue, at every level, has now been closed. Tony's brother, Todd Bertolet, says it plainly to reporters. The appeals on the merits have been made, and they've been denied and exhausted. What comes out over the course of this case is the picture of a man who spent 2 decades performing a version of himself that didn't exist. Hinthorn told people he was a successful businessman, an entrepreneur, someone whose time was valuable and whose finances were solid. In reality, he hadn't held steady work since 1992. He lived, for years, off the insurance proceeds from Lynn's death, all while presenting an image to family, friends, and 2 wives that had almost nothing to do with the truth underneath it. And Lynn Hinthorn's case remains open in the sense that matters most. No charges have ever been filed in her death. The man investigators believe killed her has spent the years since Tony's trial behind bars for one murder, while the first one sits unresolved, a case with no formal ending at all. That's the part of this story that should stay uncomfortable. Not the verdict, not the sentencing. The fact that one death got justice because investigators eventually connected it to a pattern, and the other is still waiting, 17 years later, for anyone to build a case at all. That gap between suspicion and proof is exactly where people get hurt the longest, and it's exactly why recognizing danger early, before there's a pattern to look back on, matters as much as it does. If that unresolved feeling sits with you, that's what Invisible Until It Is Not was built to help close. If you want the full breakdown, how targets are chosen, what your digital life reveals without you knowing, the script manipulators follow, and what to do in the first 60 minutes if something goes wrong, it's all in my guide. Links in the description and pinned comment. Tell us in the comments if you think Lynn's case should be formally reopened for charges after all this time, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. If you want to keep following cases like this one, where the truth took years to catch up to what happened, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. October 3rd, 1984. A quiet village north of Toronto called Queensville. A school bus pulls up to a small house and lets off a 9-year-old girl. She waves to the driver. She walks inside alone. Nobody knows it yet, but this is the last time anyone will see Christine Jessup walk through that door. She was supposed to head out again that afternoon, just a short walk to the village park, to meet a friend. She never showed up. And by the time her mother and older brother got home that evening, the house was empty. Her jacket, gone. Her shoes, gone. Christine, gone. What happened in the hours after that school bus pulled away would become one of the most unique case that would take 36 years, destroy an innocent man's life, and rewrite the rules of how DNA evidence is used to catch killers. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the person responsible was never a stranger. He was someone the family already knew. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning. Before we go further, if you're new here, make sure you're subscribed. We cover cases exactly like this one every week. Cases that start ordinary and end up changing an entire justice system. And drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. It always surprises me how far these stories travel. Now, back to Queensville. In 1984, Queensville wasn't much more than a handful of homes clustered around a general store, a small church, a cemetery, and a community park with a ball diamond. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where kids were sent outside to play and only expected home before the streetlights came on. Everyone more or less knew everyone. Christine Jessup grew up in that world. She was 9 years old, described by those who knew her as a girl who loved life, her family, her school, her sports. The kind of kid who, when she stayed the weekend at her grandparents' house, would still call home just to say hi. That particular Friday, she was alone in the house for a reason. Her father, Bob Jessup, had been taken into custody 2 weeks earlier on charges of misappropriating funds. That afternoon, her mother Janet and her older brother Kenny had driven into Toronto to visit him at the East Detention Center. Janet made the call that 9-year-old Christine was too young to come along and see her father behind bars. So she left her home, expecting her back before they returned. When Janet and Kenny got back to Queensville that evening, the house was empty. No note, no sign of where she'd gone. And for a family that knew their daughter well, a girl who wasn't the type to wander off, who always kept people posted, the silence didn't add up. Word spread through the small community almost immediately. Within hours, Queensville wasn't just a village anymore, it was a search zone. Neighbors, friends of the family, people who'd never even met Christine, came out in the dark and the cold to comb fields and ditches and backyards. Her photograph went out to local police, then regional police, then the news. Within days, her face was on television sets and front pages across the province. A 9-year-old girl vanished without a trace, in a place where nothing like this was supposed to happen. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Christmas came and went in the Jessup household with an empty chair at the table. And still, nothing. No leads that held up. No sign of Christine. Then, on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1984, nearly 3 months after she disappeared, that silence broke. Not with the news the family had been praying for. In a rural stretch of land near the town of Sunderland, roughly 50 kilometers from the Jessup home, someone made a discovery that would end the search and begin an entirely different kind of investigation. One that, decades later, would expose a wrongful conviction, a broken system, and a killer who had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. What they found in Sunderland that day and what it set in motion is where we pick up next. If this story has you on edge already, that's exactly the point, because what comes next involves a man who was innocent, a trial that got it catastrophically wrong, and a killer who wouldn't be named for another 36 years. Subscribe now so you don't miss part 2. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? A phone rings inside a forensic laboratory. On the other end, a lawyer waits and does not know that whatever happens next is about to unravel 8 years of Guy Paul Morin's life in one direction and blow the entire case of who killed Christine Jessup wide open in another. It's January 23rd, 1995, and the results on the other end of that call are unambiguous. The physical evidence at the center of the Crown's case against Morin had always included biological material recovered from Christine's underwear at the crime scene. For years, that evidence had been treated as damning. But forensic DNA testing had advanced dramatically since Morin's 1992 conviction, And when investigators finally applied this newer, more precise technology to that sample, the results told a different story than the one the courtroom had accepted. The semen found on Christine's underwear did not belong to Guy Paul Morin. Not inconclusive. Not a partial match open to interpretation. A conclusive exclusion. Whoever had left that evidence at the scene of Christine Jessup's murder, it was not the quiet neighbor sitting in an Ontario prison cell. The Crown and the defense submitted this new evidence jointly. There was no dramatic courtroom battle over whether to accept it. The science simply didn't allow for one. And with that, Guy Paul Morin, convicted of first-degree murder in 1992, was acquitted. He walked out of prison having served 18 months for a crime that DNA evidence now proved he did not commit. 18 months is not a small number. It's over 500 days spent in a cell, branded in his community and across the country as a child killer, all while the actual killer remained free, unnamed, unbothered. Think about what those 18 months actually meant. Every single day inside, Morin knew he was innocent. Every single day, somewhere out there, the person genuinely responsible for what happened to Christine was walking free, possibly still living in the same region, possibly still crossing paths with people who had no idea. Morin's exoneration didn't just clear his name. It reopened a wound for the Jessup family that had barely begun to close. They had spent years believing justice had been served. Now they were being told it hadn't. Somewhere, the person who did this to their daughter was still out there. The fallout from Morin's wrongful conviction reached far beyond his own life. What had happened wasn't a fluke or a rare miscarriage of justice. It was the product of systemic failures, jailhouse informant testimony that was later heavily criticized, tunnel vision investigating that had locked onto Morin early and never seriously looked elsewhere, and forensic techniques that, at the time of his original trial, simply weren't advanced enough to rule him out or in with real certainty. In 1996, the government of Ontario responded by appointing a formal public inquiry, led by Justice Fred Kaufman, to examine exactly how this had happened. The Kaufman Commission spent years combing through the case, interviewing investigators, lawyers, and forensic experts, building a picture of every point where the system had gone wrong. Its findings were released in April of 1998, and they didn't just address Morin's case specifically. They became a landmark document in Canadian legal history, reshaping how police handle informant testimony, how forensic evidence gets weighed in court, and how wrongful convictions get identified and prevented going forward. If you've ever heard true crime commentators talk about the dangers of tunnel vision policing, this case and this inquiry are a large part of why that conversation exists in Canada today. But for the Jessup family, none of that institutional reform answered the one question that actually mattered to them. Who killed Christine? The case was formally reopened in 1995 following Morin's exoneration. Investigators went back through old evidence, old leads, and old interviews with fresh eyes, hoping that something previously overlooked would finally point them toward the real killer. For about 3 years, that effort continued. And then, without a viable suspect, without new forensic capability advanced enough to identify a DNA profile against a national database, the trail went cold again. Christine Jessup's murder shifted from an active investigation into something far more painful for a family to live with, an open wound with no name attached to it. For the next quarter century, the person responsible for her death lived somewhere in the world completely unknown. He could have been anyone. He could have walked past members of the Jessup family at a grocery store, sat near them at a restaurant, and none of them would have had the faintest idea. If you've been with us through this series, you already know this feeling doesn't stay abstract for long. We've now covered 2 different cases where the person responsible spent decades hiding in plain sight, in communities where people trusted their neighbors completely. That's not a coincidence of storytelling. It's a pattern worth understanding, and it's part of why we built our safety guide the way we did. Not to make you paranoid, but to help you recognize the actual warning signs that get lost in cases like this one. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's linked in the description, and it directly supports us continuing to bring you cases the rest of the internet has moved on from. For 25 years, that was where Christine Jessup's case sat. Unsolved. A grieving family with no answers. To understand how that name appeared after decades of nothing, you have to understand what had changed in forensic science since the case first went cold. By the late 2010s, a new investigative technique had emerged, one that had already made headlines by helping identify some of the most notorious unidentified killers in the United States. Genetic genealogy. Instead of trying to match crime scene DNA directly against a database of known offenders, this method builds out family trees from DNA relatives, however distant, who had voluntarily submitted their own genetic information to consumer ancestry services. It's slow. It's painstaking. It can take investigators through hundreds of branches of unrelated families before narrowing down to a single name. But when it works with a level of precision no other method in criminal investigation has ever offered. Investigators sent the DNA evidence recovered decades earlier from the scene of Christine's murder to a specialized forensic genealogy team. Over the following months, that team worked backward through generations of family trees, cross-referencing distant relatives, narrowing an impossibly wide net down branch by branch. Eventually, that process led them to a single candidate. Toronto police then compared that candidate's profile against a corresponding sample held by Ontario's Centre for Forensic Sciences. It was a match. Calvin Hoover was 28 years old in 1984, the year Christine was murdered. And here is the detail that should stop you cold, the detail that separates this case from a stranger danger story you might have grown up hearing about. Hoover was not unknown to the Jessup family. He was known to them. His wife had worked alongside Christine's father. This was not a man who slipped into Queensville from somewhere else, snatched a child, and disappeared back into anonymity. This was someone with a connection to the household, someone who had reason to be near them, someone who, by every account we have, the family had no reason to fear. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters more than almost anything else in this case. We grow up being taught to watch for strangers, unfamiliar cars, unfamiliar faces. But Christine wasn't taken by a stranger. She was taken by proximity, by trust, by a connection so ordinary that nobody ever thought to question it. That's not a detail that belongs only in this story. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in cases exactly like this one. And it's the entire reason we built our safety guide around recognizing relational risk instead of just the stranger danger warnings most of us were raised on. If that unsettles you even slightly, it should. And if you want to actually understand how to recognize those patterns before they become a headline, the guide is linked below. Every copy purchased goes directly toward us, continuing to tell the stories other channels won't touch. On October 15, 2020, Toronto Police Chief James Raymer stood in front of reporters at Toronto Police Headquarters, alongside Staff Superintendent Peter Code of Detective Operations, and made the announcement publicly for the first time. He confirmed the DNA matched to Calvin Hoover. And then he said something that has stayed with everyone who has followed this case since. He said that if Hoover were alive today, Toronto police would arrest him for the murder of Christine Jessup. If he were alive today, Calvin Hoover had died in 2015, 5 years before investigators ever connected his name to this case. According to Christine's brother, Kenny Jessup, speaking afterward to media, Hoover's death was by suicide, though this detail comes from the family's account and has not been confirmed through an official police statement. What we do know for certain is this. The man responsible for Christine Jessup's murder was never arrested, never tried, never faced a courtroom, a jury, or a single moment of public accountability for what he did. He lived out the rest of his life, more than 3 decades of it, walking free. There is no trial to close out this story, no verdict to bring closure. For the Jessup family, the answer to who did this arrived, finally, after 36 years, but justice in any courtroom since never did, and never will. That's a harder ending than most true crime cases offer, and it's worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over. When the system can't deliver an ending, sometimes the only thing that can offer any sense of protection going forward is understanding how these situations happen in the first place, recognizing the warning signs that get missed, and knowing what to actually do with that knowledge. That's the entire premise behind the guide we've built into this series. And if this case is the one that finally makes it click for you, it's linked below. Christine's mother, Janet Jessup, spent the following years still trying to help other families going through the same nightmare, reportedly continuing to take calls from investigators working other missing children cases long after her daughter's killer had been identified. She passed away on March 15, 2024. Her son Kenny buried her beside Christine on October 3rd of that year, 40 years to the day since his sister disappeared from their home in Queensville. In August of 2025, the Jessup family told their full story publicly for the first time in a 3-part documentary series released on Crave. For decades, this case had been told through police statements, court transcripts, and news reports. That series was the first time the people who lived through it, not around it, got to shape how their own story was told. Christine Jessup was 9 years old. She loved her family, her school, and her sports. For 36 years, The person responsible for her death lived his life freely, in the same community, connected to people who trusted him completely. The case that resulted changed a family forever, exposed catastrophic failures in Canada's justice system, and ultimately helped pioneer forensic techniques that continue to close cold cases across North America today. Would you have suspected someone your own family already trusted? Be honest in the comments, because I think most people wouldn't have, and that's exactly what makes this case impossible to forget. There's a kind of evil that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look different from anyone else. It doesn't live in the shadows. It walks the same streets you walk. It shops at the same stores. It waves at the same neighbors. It drives the same roads through the same town for decades, and nobody knows. This is that kind of story. On the evening of Sunday, March 15th, 1964, a 12-year-old girl named Mary Teresa Simpson left the corner of East Market and Harriet Streets in Elmira, New York, and started walking home. She was quiet by nature, shy, the kind of child who didn't draw attention, didn't make waves, didn't give anyone a reason to worry about her. She had spent the evening visiting family, the way children do. She was heading home, the way children do. She never made it. Somewhere between that street corner and her front door, something happened, and the man responsible went home that same night. He sat down. He ate. He slept. He woke up the next morning. He went about his life. He watched Elmira move on around him. He watched police question hundreds of people, and he was not one of them. He watched a reward go unclaimed for decades. He watched investigators reach dead end after dead end. And eventually, he grew old. He had a family. He had children and grandchildren. He held a job, paid his bills, and in March 2004, almost exactly 40 years to the day after Mary Teresa Simpson never came home, he died, quietly, of natural causes, a free man. He was buried in Elmira, the same city, the same ground. For 62 years, Mary's family had no name to attach to what had been done to her. Her sister waited. Her mother waited. The detectives who worked the case waited. Generations of Elmira police officers inherited the file and waited. 300 suspects were questioned. Rewards went uncollected. DNA was tested twice across 2 separate decades and came back empty both times. The case file grew thicker. The years grew longer. And the answer stayed buried until November 5th, 2025, when investigators picked up a shovel. What they pulled from the ground that day, the DNA extracted from the remains of a man already more than 2 decades dead, would produce a result so statistically definitive that the odds of it belonging to anyone else were less than 1 in 320 billion. This is not a number that leaves room for doubt. This is a number that ends arguments. On February 10th, 2026, the Elmira Police Department stood in front of cameras at the Chemung County District Attorney's office and did something they had never been able to do in 62 years. They said a name. This case, Mary Teresa Simpson's case, has been classified as the oldest cold case in American history ever solved using forensic DNA evidence. Not just in New York, not just in the Northeast, in the entire country. 62 years of silence, broken by a speck of biological material invisible to the naked eye, recovered from a piece of clothing that sat in a police department freezer for over 6 decades. Before we go any further, I need to say something directly to you. If you're watching this and you're not subscribed to XTC Uncovered, I want you to think about something real. Mary Teresa Simpson's family waited 62 years for someone to say her name loud enough for the world to hear. That is 62 years of Sunday evenings passing without answers. 62 years of birthdays and holidays and quiet moments where that question never left the room. The least, and I mean the absolute least, that any of us can do right now is make sure her story reaches one more person, one more set of eyes, one more human being who will carry her name forward. That is all a subscribe costs you. One click. That is what justice looks like from where you're sitting right now. And if something is genuinely stopping you, if you have a reason you are holding on to, drop in the comments when this is over. I will read it, because that conversation matters too. For now, stay with me. Because before we get to the man in that grave, you need to know the girl he took. You need to know who Mary Teresa Simpson was before March 15th, 1964 turned her name into a case number. You need to know her family, her home, her world, and the last hours of an ordinary Sunday evening that became anything but. That is where this story begins. Every victim in every true crime story was a person before they were a case. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud. But somewhere between the police reports and the autopsy findings and the decades of investigative dead ends, it becomes easy to forget. The name starts to feel like a headline. The details start to feel like data. And the human being at the center of all of it quietly disappears beneath the weight of what happened to them. So before we go any further into what was done to Mary Teresa Simpson, we're going to talk about who she was. Because she was somebody. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's little sister, somebody's quiet, shy, good-hearted child, and she deserves to be seen as that before she is seen as anything else. Mary Teresa Simpson was born in 1951 or 1952 in Elmira, New York. She grew up in a working-class household in a mid-sized city in the southern tier of New York State, a place where everybody more or less knew everybody, where neighbors recognized faces on the street, and where a child walking home in the evening was not yet the kind of thing that sent a community into panic. Her father was Ellsworth Simpson. Her mother was Rose Simpson. Together, they had built a family that included an older brother, an older sister named Linda, and an older half-brother. Mary was one of the younger ones, the quiet one, the one people described the same way every single time they were asked, shy, gentle, well-behaved. Not the kind of child who caused trouble, not the kind who demanded attention. Just a 12-year-old girl trying to navigate a world that was already getting complicated around her. Because by the time March 1964 arrived, Mary's home life was not what it had once been. In May 1963, less than a year before her death, Ellsworth and Rose Simpson separated. The family fractured the way families do, quietly and permanently, and Mary went to live with her father. For a child who is already shy by nature, that kind of disruption lands differently than it does for adults. Routines disappear. The house feels different. The people you counted on are suddenly in two separate places, and you are learning how to move between them. Then, in late 1963, Ellsworth relocated with Mary to Hammondsport, New York, a small village tucked along the western shore of Keuka Lake, roughly 40 miles southwest of Elmira. It was a quieter place, smaller, further from the life Mary had known. And it meant that her contact with her mother, Rose, was reduced to once a month. Once a month. For a 12-year-old girl who had just watched her parents' marriage end, that is a long time between visits. Then in early March 1964, just days before everything changed, Ellsworth found new work back in Elmira and moved them home again. 2 relocations in less than a year. 2 sets of adjustments. 2 different versions of normal to adapt to. Mary was doing what children do in the middle of adult decisions. She was managing. She was holding it together. She was quietly going about the business of being 12 years old in a family that was still figuring itself out. There is one more detail about this family that I need you to hold on to. At the time Mary was killed, her mother, Rose Simpson, was pregnant. She was carrying Mary's younger sister while burying the daughter she already had. That is the kind of grief that does not have a bottom. Mary's older sister, Linda, who was 16 years old when it happened, recalled it decades later in words that have stayed with everyone who heard them. She said she could not believe her little sister was lying in a casket. She said she tried to climb in. She said she wanted to be in there with her. 16 years old, trying to get into a casket with her 12-year-old sister. That is who this family was. That is what this case cost them before it even became a case. Now, March 15th, 1964, a Sunday. Mary left her father Ellsworth's apartment at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She told him she was going to visit her cousin. What she did not tell him was that she planned to stop and see her mother Rose first. Not out of deception, out of love. The quiet, careful love of a child trying to keep peace between 2 separate worlds. She spent about an hour at Rose's house. Then she left for her cousin's. She departed her cousin's home around 6:30 in the evening. At approximately 7 o'clock, a friend spotted her in front of a local store at the corner of East Market and Harriet Streets in Elmira. She said she was heading home. That is the last confirmed sighting of Mary Teresa Simpson alive. By 10:30 that night, her father Ellsworth had not heard from her. By 11 o'clock, he picked up the phone and called the Elmira Police Department. She never walked through that door. Before we go into what happened next, and what investigators found 4 days later, I need to stop here for a moment and speak to you directly. If you're watching this without being subscribed to this channel, I want you to ask yourself something honest. If this were your sister walking home that evening, if this were your family sitting by the phone at 11 o'clock at night, waiting for a 12-year-old who never came back, would you want the world to look away? Would you want people to move on to the next thing without pausing long enough to actually hear the story? Subscribe to XTC Uncovered. Keep Mary's story moving. Keep it reaching people who have never heard her name. It costs you nothing. It means more than you know. And if something is stopping you, leave in the comments. I'm listening. For days. That is how long Mary Teresa Simpson lay in the woods before anyone found her. For days of her father waiting. For days of her mother waiting. For days of a pregnant woman sitting somewhere in Elmira, New York, not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead, while carrying another child inside her. For days of a 16-year-old sister going to sleep every night wondering. For days of a city that did not yet understand what had happened inside its own borders. When Mary did not come home on the evening of March 15th, 1964, the Elmira Police Department received the missing persons report from her father Ellsworth somewhere between 10:30 and 11 o'clock that night. And in 1964, a missing child report did not carry the same immediate urgency that it does today. There was no Amber Alert. No coordinated multi-agency response triggered within the first hour. Police were not initially alarmed. The assumption, the way it often was in that era, was that the child would turn up. She did not turn up. The following day, March 16th, investigators began searching vacant homes in the area. They reached out to some of Mary's friends. They contacted the Chemung County District Attorney's Office and acknowledged that the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were not normal. By March 18th, 3 days in, the Elmira Police Department formally began treating the case as a suspected foul play situation. Law enforcement notifications went out to police departments across both New York State and Pennsylvania. Junkyards were searched. Abandoned properties were checked. The search widened. Then on the morning of March 19th, 1964, a man went hiking with his 2 sons near Combs Hill Road in Southport, New York, a wooded area on the outskirts of Elmira, situated off an old logging road that locals knew as a spot used by courting couples and by children who played in the surrounding woods. Somewhere between 5 and 7 miles from where Mary was last seen alive. He found her. Mary Teresa Simpson's frozen, fully clothed body was lying in the woods, partially concealed beneath twigs, branches, leaves, and dirt. But it was not just leaves and branches covering her. There were 4 heavy stones placed on top of her. 4 of them. The largest weighed approximately 110 pounds. The total weight of the stones placed over that 12-year-old girl's body was reported at the time to be around 320 pounds. Only a portion of her hand and 1 sneaker were visible above the surface. Her mouth had been stuffed with dirt and twigs. The Chemung County Medical Examiner conducted the autopsy and determined that Mary had been strangled. Her cause of death was asphyxiation. The examination also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators concluded that she had been killed at or very near the location where her body was found. Take a moment with those stones. 4 of them, 1 weighing over 100 pounds. Someone did not run. Someone did not panic and flee the scene. Someone stood in those woods over the body of a 12-year-old girl and deliberately placed those stones, one by one, to keep her hidden. That is not an accident. That is not a moment of impulse followed by fear. That is cold, calculated concealment. That is someone who intended to never be found. They were right for a very long time. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in Elmira's history. Officers canvassed neighborhoods. Tips were followed. Leads were chased. By October 1964, 7 months after Mary's body was found, the Elmira Police Department had formally questioned 300 people. 300 individual interviews. 300 names looked at, investigated, and ultimately ruled out or set aside. Local radio station WELM and the Elmira Star-Gazette newspaper jointly raised a $1,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest. The community responded with tips. None of them led anywhere. The years passed. By 1972, 8 years after the murder, the Star-Gazette raised the reward to $5,000. It remained unclaimed. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning were aging out of the department, passing the file to younger officers who had not yet been born when Mary disappeared. The case became institutional. It became something the department carried with it the way a scar is carried. Always there, never fully gone, occasionally re-examined when new technology or new information offered a fresh angle. Retired Officer William Maloney, who joined the Elmira Police Department 1 year after Mary's death and worked on various aspects of the investigation over the years, stood in a room on February 10, 2026, and said something that captures the scale of the failure perfectly. He said he walked a beat in those days and met 1 million people. He said the name of the man who killed Mary Teresa Simpson was not one of them. In thousands of pages of investigative files built over 62 years, that name did not appear once. Then came the science. In 2003, nearly 4 decades after the murder, investigators submitted pieces of Mary's clothing, including her skirt and her underwear, to the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center. Scientists confirmed the presence of semen on her skirt. A DNA profile was extracted and entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national database designed to match unknown DNA profiles against those of convicted offenders and other cases. There was no match. In 2014, the DNA was resubmitted. Again, no match. Twice. 2 separate decades. 2 separate attempts with the best technology available at those respective times. And both times, the database returned silence. Whoever killed Mary had never had his DNA collected by law enforcement. He had lived in the gap, in the space between what investigators could find and what the system could reach. But here is the detail that made everything that came after even possible at all. Mary's clothing had been stored in a freezer at Elmira Police Department headquarters since 1964. Standard evidence preservation practice at the time, detectives in 1964 had no way of knowing what DNA was, let alone what it would one day be capable of doing. They preserve the evidence because that is what you do. And that instinct, that simple procedural habit from 6 decades ago, is the only reason this story has the ending it does. In 2022, Elmira Police Sergeant William Goodwin secured a grant through the nonprofit organization Season of Justice for advanced forensic DNA testing. The FBI was brought in as a formal partner on the case. What they were working with was described publicly by Sergeant Goodwin in terms that make the stakes almost unbearable: 0.4 nanograms of DNA, a quantity invisible to the naked eye. And as Goodwin explained at the press conference, when DNA testing is performed, the DNA itself is consumed in the process. There are no second chances. If a usable profile could not be developed from that 0.4 nanograms, the last remaining biological evidence in a 62-year-old child murder case will be gone permanently. FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen packaged the sample in dry ice and shipped it to Othram Incorporated, a forensic DNA laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, specializing in recovering usable genetic profiles from damaged, degraded, or microscopic samples. Then the shipment stopped moving. An ice storm had shut down the FedEx hub in Memphis, Tennessee, the largest FedEx distribution hub in the world. The package sat stranded. Jensen later recalled that they could not reach anyone at FedEx during the storm. If the dry ice gave out, the sample would be compromised. Decades of waiting, 2 failed database submissions, 1 grant, 1 last shot, all of it sitting in a frozen package in a grounded facility in Memphis, while a clock nobody could see ticked quietly toward 0. The package survived. The dry ice held. The sample arrived intact. In 2023, the Elmira Police Department partnered with the Russell Sage College Criminal Investigation Resource Center, directed by Christina Lane, an associate professor of criminal justice and criminologist. Students at the center organized and digitized thousands of pages of case files, conducted site surveys, and performed detailed reviews of suspect leads and forensic evidence. giving investigators a cleaner, more organized foundation to work from as the DNA process moved forward. The profile was completed. The search began. And this is where I need to stop and speak to you directly again. A package containing the last piece of evidence that could identify the killer of a 12-year-old girl sat in the middle of an ice storm, one temperature change away from being lost forever. If that dry ice had failed, you would not be watching this video right now. There would be no ending to give. Mary's family would have received nothing. That kind of near miss is exactly why this channel exists. Because these stories are fragile. Because the people inside them are real. And because someone has to keep showing up to tell them. If you're not subscribed to XTC Uncovered, do it now. Not later. Right now. If something is genuinely stopping you, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments at the end of this video. Othram Incorporated received the sample. The scientists got to work. Using a process called forensic genetic genealogy, the laboratory built a comprehensive DNA profile from that 0.4 nanogram sample. A quantity so small, it had no visible physical presence whatsoever. That completed profile was then uploaded into 2 public genealogy databases, the kind that ordinary people use every day to trace their ancestry, find distant relatives, and build family trees going back generations. And somewhere in those databases, a thread appeared. The FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team pulled on that thread. They began constructing family trees from the data, cross-referencing ancestry records, public documents, and genealogical connections, working backward and forward through generations of families with DNA profiles that shared markers with the unknown suspect. It is painstaking work. It is the kind of investigative process that moves in weeks and months rather than hours and days. But it moves, and eventually it arrived somewhere. A familial match surfaced. The DNA profile shared a genetic connection with a living individual, a man who was identified as the son of the suspect. Investigators approached that son. He agreed to submit a DNA sample. When that sample came back, it confirmed the familial link. The family tree that the FBI had been building quietly pointed in one direction. The name at the end of that direction was Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. Born in 1931 in Elmira, New York. Raised in the same city as Mary Teresa Simpson, a United States Army veteran who served from 1951 to 1959 during the Korean War era. After his military service, he returned to civilian life in Elmira and worked as a truck driver for Mayflower Van Lines. He was married. He had 3 children and 2 grandchildren. To anyone who encountered him across the decades of his life, he was a working man, a family man, a veteran from a small city in upstate New York who had served his country and come home to build a life. He was 32 years old on March 15, 1964. Elmira Police Sergeant William Goodwin addressed his background at the February 10, 2026 press conference with careful, deliberate language. He told reporters that Murray's record showed repeated criminal involvement over decades, involving offenses involving children. He was precise about that. He said that while no single incident in Murray's history constituted direct proof of responsibility for Mary's murder, the pattern was entirely consistent with the forensic findings and the circumstances of the crime. And the pattern extended back further than Alfred himself. His father, Raymond Murray Sr., had been arrested as a teenager for molesting 2 7-year-old sisters. This was not a family untouched by this particular darkness. This was a pattern across generations, lived out quietly in the same small city where a 12-year-old girl was walking home one Sunday evening in 1964. Alfred Raymond Murray Jr.'s name did not appear once in the thousands of pages of investigative files compiled over 62 years. He was never questioned, never flagged, never brought in for an interview. The Elmira Police Department confirmed at the press conference that he had not been on their radar at any point during the original investigation or any of the subsequent reviews. 300 people were looked at. He was not one of them. Investigators believe the killing was a crime of opportunity. Murray did not know Mary Teresa Simpson. There was no prior relationship, no established connection between them, no evidence that he had targeted her specifically in advance. He saw her on a Sunday evening on a street corner in Elmira, and he chose her. Then he went home. By the time Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. emerged as the prime suspect from the genealogical investigation, he had already been dead for over 2 decades. He died on March 16, 2004, almost exactly 40 years to the day after Mary Simpson was reported missing by her father. He was between 72 and 73 years old at the time of his death, depending on whether his birthday had passed. He died of natural causes. He was buried in Elmira, New York, the same city, the same ground he had walked freely for 4 decades after taking a child's life. At this point in the investigation, FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen had retired from the Bureau and transitioned into a new role as a forensic case manager at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, based in Washington, D.C. When Sergeant Goodwin reached a wall, when the genealogical evidence pointed clearly at a dead man, but direct DNA confirmation required more than a familial match from a living son, Jensen told Goodwin something that changed everything. He said he believed the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children could help. The organization provided the necessary funding and brought in the expertise of a forensic anthropologist to carry out what came next. On November 5, 2025, Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. was exhumed from his grave in Elmira, New York. Dozens of Elmira police officers were present that day. Many of them were retired. Some had worked Mary's case for years, inheriting a file that had sat open their entire careers. They stood at that graveside in November 2025 and watched investigators recover the remains of the man the science was pointing to. The moment was described as deeply emotional by those who were there. These were people who had spent years, in some cases decades, looking for an answer that kept refusing to come. And now they were standing over it. Murray's remains were subjected to direct DNA comparison against the biological evidence recovered from Mary's clothing in 1964. The result was unambiguous. The probability of the DNA belonging to any person other than Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. was less than 1 in 320 billion. That is not a close call. That is a certainty expressed in scientific language. On February 10, 2026, Elmira Police Chief Kristen Thorne, Chemung County District Attorney Whedon Wetmore, Sergeant William Goodwin, and representatives from the FBI gathered at the Chemung County District Attorney's office in Elmira, New York. The room was full. Current officers stood alongside retired detectives. Journalists were present, and so was Mary's family. Chief Thorne opened the press conference with words that the Elmira Police Department had waited 62 years to say. She called it a historic day. She said it was justice after almost 62 years. She then stated directly and without qualification that if Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. were still alive, the Chemung County District Attorney's Office would seek criminal charges against him for murder. District Attorney Whedon Wetmore declined to elaborate on the specific nature of Murray's prior offenses against children, citing legal protections. The full scope of what Alfred Murray did during his lifetime, beyond what forensic evidence confirmed about Mary's case, may never be made entirely public. Sergeant Goodwin officially named Alfred Raymond Murray Jr. as the sole suspect, confirming that this resolution made Mary's case the 18th cold case in the state of New York solved by Othram Incorporated. The Elmira Police Department also confirmed that this had been their only active cold case. It is now closed. In that room, in the front, was Linda Galpin, Mary's older sister, 78 years old. She had been 16 the last time she saw her little sister. She had spent 62 years without a name to put to what had been done to her family. She stood up and addressed the room. She said she was very happy it was finally ended. She said she wished her mother could have been there to hear it. She thanked everyone involved. And then she said she was glad it was all finally settled after almost 62 years. Their mother, Rose Simpson, who had been pregnant when Mary was murdered, never learned his name. She died without it. Mary's uncle Dwayne Bowman and her cousin Ronnie Bowman were also present in that room. The family that carried this for 6 decades sat together and finally heard the answer they had been owed since 1964. But I need to leave you with one more thing. One detail that has largely gone unnoticed in the coverage of this case. The FBI's official Violent Criminal Apprehension Program database, VICAP, currently carries an active listing for Alfred Raymond Murray Jr., designated as a deceased homicide offender. At the bottom of that listing, The Elmira City Police Department is explicitly requesting that anyone with information regarding Murray and his criminal behavior come forward and contact them. That language matters. The Elmira PD's cold case file is closed, but the FBI's call regarding the broader scope of Murray's criminal behavior remains open. Murray had documented involvement with offenses against children spanning multiple decades. He was never questioned about Mary's murder, which means the question that should sit with every person watching this is a simple and deeply uncomfortable one. Was Mary Teresa Simpson his only victim? Now I need to speak to you one final time before this chapter closes. If you watch this entire story, all 4 chapters from Mary leaving that street corner in 1964 to a grave being opened in 2025, and you're still not subscribed to XTC Uncovered, I want you to sit with something real for a moment. Mary's family had no voice for 62 years. No platform, no audience, no one keeping the pressure alive or making sure her name kept moving through the world. This channel exists, so that does not happen anymore. Not to Mary, not to the next victim, not to the family sitting somewhere right now with a file that has been cold for decades and a question that has never been answered. Subscribe so this work continues. One click, that is the entire cost. And if something is genuinely stopping you from doing that, do not just close the video. Come to the comments. Tell me exactly what it is. Because if you made it through all 4 chapters of Mary Teresa Simpson's story and you still have a reason not to stay, I want to understand it. Her name was Mary Teresa Simpson. She was 12 years old. She was quiet and shy, and she was somebody's whole world. Say her name. Tennessee, Elk Valley, April the 3rd, 1985. A man is walking. It's quiet out here, the kind of quiet that only exists in the hills of Campbell County, where the trees grow close together and the roads run thin and cracked between them. He isn't looking for anything in particular, just walking. And then he stops. There, half covered by leaves and thyme, are bones. Small ones. A child's. Nobody knows her name yet. Nobody knows where she came from, how long she's been here, or what happened to her before she ended up in this ravine, forgotten by everyone except whoever left her here. Investigators will spend the next several decades calling her only one thing. Baby girl. There is one clue resting near her remains. A small necklace, strung together with plastic buttons. It's the kind of thing a teenager might make, or wear, or treasure. It will sit in an evidence file for years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. But to understand who she is, and how she ended up in these hills, we have to go back further. 7 years further. To a mall, 3 states away, on an ordinary summer night that no one thought would be the last normal night of her life. Lafayette, Indiana. The last week of July, 1978. Her name is Tracy Sue Walker. She's 15 years old, a freshman at Jefferson High School. She's a cheerleader. She's shy, but thoughtful, the kind of girl who notices things about people. She loves doing hair, and she's already dreaming about a future in the beauty industry, the kind of small, specific dream that 15-year-olds hold on to because it feels like proof that their life is going somewhere. That evening starts like any other. She's dropped off with a friend at a McDonald's. From there, the 2 of them walk over to the Tippecanoe Mall, the kind of place where teenagers went in 1978 to kill a summer evening. Nothing about the night suggests danger. Nothing suggests this is the beginning of anything at all. But somewhere between the mall and home, something changes. Tracy is last seen outside a JCPenney store. She's getting into a car. There are several men inside, older than her, and investigators would later come to believe they were temporary workers, passing through the area for a job, gone again before anyone thought to ask their names. Whether they were part of something larger, something organized, is a question that still doesn't have a clean answer. What we do know is that after that car pulls away from the JCPenney parking lot, Tracy Sue Walker is never seen alive again. Her family reports her missing. Tracy got into that car because the men inside gave her no reason to think twice. That's not naivety. That's exactly how selection works. Predators don't choose their targets randomly. They choose them based on signals most people broadcast without ever realizing it. If you've ever wondered what those signals actually are and how to stop giving them off without living in fear, that's exactly what Invisible Until It Is Not breaks down. Real documented cases, real patterns, written for people who'd rather see it coming than wonder afterward. Link is in the description. The silence begins. The kind of silence that swallows a family whole. No leads. No car. No names. Just a 15-year-old girl who vanished from a mall parking lot on a summer night, and a group of men who seemed to disappear as completely as she did. For her parents, there will be no answers in their lifetime. They will die not knowing where their daughter is, or what happened to her, or whether she suffered. They will die still hoping, in whatever way a person can keep hoping after so many years of nothing. And in Tennessee, a set of remains sits unidentified, unclaimed, and unexplained, in a case file under a name that isn't really a name at all. 2 threads, 1 girl, and for nearly 4 decades, no one would think to connect them. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened between that mall parking lot in Lafayette and that ravine in Elk Valley. Someone was in that car. Someone knows exactly how those 7 years, and those 2 places, and this one girl's life, all come together. We're going to find out how investigators finally connected Baby Girl to the missing girl from Indiana, and just how long it actually took to give her back her name. Because the identification is only half of this story. The other half, the question of who did this to her, is a thread this case still hasn't managed to close. A small sample of bone leaves Campbell County, Tennessee, and travels to a laboratory in Texas. Nobody knows it yet, but this is the moment 37 years of silence finally starts to break. The lab is called Othram, and unlike the investigators who worked this case in 1985, they don't need a missing persons file sitting on the right desk. They don't need a fingerprint match or a dental record. All they need is DNA and the patience to trace it backward through a family tree until it leads somewhere real. Working alongside the University of Tennessee's anthropology department, the sample from Baby Girl's remains is processed and analyzed. This is forensic genetic genealogy, the same kind of science that has been quietly cracking open cold cases all over the country, giving names back to people who had been reduced to case numbers for decades. It works by comparing DNA against enormous public genealogy databases full of ordinary people who submitted their own DNA out of curiosity about their ancestry, never imagining it might one day help solve a murder. And it works. The lab finds a possible relative, someone living, right now, in Indiana. For the first time in 37 years, Baby Girl has a location. Not just a state, a specific area. Lafayette. TBI intelligence analysts take this thread and start pulling. They begin searching for families in the Lafayette area who might be connected to this possible relative. And somewhere in that search, they find something that makes every investigator's pulse quicken. A family that had reported a girl missing. In 1978, at the age of 15. This is the moment cold case investigators wait their entire careers for. The moment 2 completely separate threads, one from a ravine in Tennessee, one from a mall parking lot in Indiana, finally cross. But a possible match isn't a confirmed match. Not yet. To make this official, to give Baby Girl her name back in a way that will hold up, investigators need something more concrete than a genealogical lead. They need a direct comparison. So they reach out to the family. They ask for DNA samples from potential siblings, people who might share enough genetic material with Baby Girl to prove, scientifically, undeniably, that she is who they now suspect she is. Those samples are submitted to the TBI crime lab in Nashville and entered into CODIS, the national DNA database used to make these kinds of connections official. And the answer comes back exactly the way investigators hoped it would. August the 30th, 2022. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation makes it official. Baby Girl has a name. She is Tracy Sue Walker, the 15-year-old freshman who vanished from a mall in Lafayette, Indiana, in the summer of 1978. 37 years after her remains were found. 44 years after she disappeared. A girl who had been a case file, a nickname, a set of bones in an evidence room, is finally, officially, herself again. But here's the part of this moment that makes it almost unbearable. Tracy's parents aren't alive to hear it. They spent their entire remaining lives not knowing, and they died without the answer that finally arrives decades too late for them. So agents don't call her mother. They don't call her father. Instead, Special Agent Brandon Elkins picks up the phone and calls Tracy's brother, Randy Walker, the last living member of her immediate family, who can finally be told the truth. Randy will later describe that call as the happiest day of his life. Sit with that for a moment. The happiest day of his life is the day he learned, with absolute certainty, that his sister has been dead since 1978. That's what 4 decades of not knowing does to a family. Confirmation, even confirmation of the worst possible outcome, becomes a form of mercy because it's better than the alternative. Better than spending the rest of your life wondering. I never did forget about her, Randy would later say. It was so hard not knowing. So there it is. The mystery of who baby girl was is solved. Science did what 4 decades of traditional police work couldn't. A name was given back to a girl who had been nameless for longer than most people's entire adult lives. But identifying a victim and solving her murder are two completely different things. Tracy Sue Walker finally has her name back. What she doesn't have, what her brother doesn't have, what nobody investigating this case has, is the name of the person or people who put her in that ravine in the first place. That part of this story isn't solved. Not even close. And what investigators uncover next pulls this case into something far bigger than one girl, one family, or one summer night in 1978. A classroom. Elizabethton, Tennessee. A sociology teacher stands in front of 20 students, and instead of handing them a textbook, he hands them a case file. 6 murders. 1 attempted murder. All unsolved for decades. He has no idea that what happens in this classroom over the next several years will end up connecting directly to the girl found in a ravine outside Campbell County. That teacher is Alex Campbell. The year is 2018. And the case he's about to hand his students has a name investigators gave it back in the 1980s, when women with red or reddish hair started turning up along highways across Tennessee, Kentucky, and neighboring states. Up to 14 of them, found between 1983 and 1985. Investigators call it the Redhead Murders. A multi-state task force forms that same year, 1985, the exact year Tracy's remains are discovered in Elk Valley. And then, like so many other things in this story, the investigation stalls. Alex Campbell had lived in this area his entire life. He'd never even heard of these murders. Nobody had reached a consensus on whether one person was responsible, whether a serial killer had been operating undetected through these hills for years. So he gives the case to his students, not expecting a class project to succeed where law enforcement had failed for over 3 decades. But it does. The students dig through case files, cross-reference victims, and start noticing patterns law enforcement hadn't connected. They give their suspect a name, the Bible Belt Strangler. And through their research, combined with new forensic work, investigators eventually connect the pattern to a real person. Jerry Leon Johns, a convicted felon, previously sentenced for strangling a woman and leaving her along Interstate 40. Johns died in 2015 in a Kentucky prison, years before any of this would be pieced together. For a moment, it looks like the case might close. 5 of the Redhead murder victims have now been identified. Lisa Nichols, Michelle Inman, Tina McKinney Farmer, Elizabeth Lamott, and Tracy Sue Walker. But here's where I need to stop the story and be exact with you, because this is the part where a lot of true crime coverage gets sloppy, and I'm not going to do that to Tracy or her family. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has been direct about this. There is no evidence connecting Jerry Johns to the murder of Tracy Sue Walker. None. Investigators have said the same about Elizabeth Lamott. Johns may be responsible for other deaths in this pattern, but as of right now, the person who killed Tracy remains completely unidentified. Her case, along with Lamott's and Inman's, is still described by investigators as active and ongoing. So despite everything, despite the DNA, despite the science, despite 37 years of searching for a name, the central question of this entire story is still sitting wide open. Who was in that car outside the JCPenney in 1978? Who drove her from Lafayette, Indiana into the hills of Tennessee? Who left her in that ravine? There's a reward now. Here's something that should unsettle you. If this happened today instead of 1978, a predator wouldn't even need a mall parking lot. Your location, your routine, your relationships, most of it is already sitting online for anyone patient enough to look. Invisible until it is not, walks you through exactly what your digital presence reveals without your knowledge, and the specific changes you can make in under 30 minutes to close that door. It's linked below if you want to actually do something with the discomfort this case just gave you. $10,000, authorized by Governor Bill Lee at the request of District Attorney Jared Effler, for information leading to an arrest and conviction. And there are still people actively working this case who refuse to let it fade. One of Alex Campbell's students, Hannah Metcalf, keeps a photograph of Tracy on her desk. She said that every time she looks at it, she's reminded she still has more work to do. Their research became a podcast called Murder 101, and later, a documentary series. But a podcast doesn't solve a murder. People do. Somebody, somewhere, knows something about that car, those men, or that summer night in 1978, and has simply never said it out loud. If this is the first video of mine you've watched, and you're not subscribed by the end of it, I'm genuinely curious what it would take. Tell me in the comments. And if you know anyone from Lafayette, Indiana, or anyone who's lived in East Tennessee long enough to remember 1978, send them this video. That's how cases like this actually move forward, not through police departments alone, but through ordinary people finally connecting a piece they didn't know mattered. Because somewhere out there, someone still knows exactly what happened to Tracy Sue Walker. And it isn't too late to say her name and finally tell the truth. The wind moves through the pines the way it always does at 9,000 feet thin, sharp, indifferent. Toni Henthorne steps carefully over loose rock, camera in hand, looking for the shot. Below her, the land falls away into nothing. No trail marker, no guardrail, no one else for miles. Her husband is a few feet behind her. He's the one who brought her here off the marked path, deeper into the backcountry than she's ever gone with him. It's their anniversary, 12 years married, and he told her this spot would be worth it. The view, he said. Wait until you see the view. She lifts the camera. He watches her. And then there is only the sound of the wind. Minutes later, a 911 call goes out from a cell phone with barely enough signal to connect. A man's voice, breathless, describing a fall. His wife, she slipped, he says. She was taking a photo, and she went over. Rescue teams will spend hours reaching the site. When they do, they'll find a woman who fell more than 100 feet down an unmarked cliff face in one of the most remote corners of Rocky Mountain National Park. And they'll find a husband who says he watched it happen and couldn't do a single thing to stop it. That's the story he tells. It is not the story investigators end up believing. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. In today's case, we're covering the death of Dr. Toni Henthorne, a story that took federal investigators over 2 years to unravel, and that would eventually connect to a second death 17 years earlier that everyone had already agreed was just a tragic accident. Before we go further, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss where this one goes, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Toni Bertollet Henthorne was 50 years old. She was a respected ophthalmologist, originally from Mississippi, known by colleagues and patients as sharp, warm, and meticulous. She wasn't an experienced hiker. Backcountry trekking wasn't really her thing. But it was September 29, 2012, her wedding anniversary, and her husband, Harold Henthorne, had planned a hike through Rocky Mountain National Park to celebrate. To everyone who knew them, Harold was a devoted husband. 58 years old, living in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, he described himself as a successful businessman, the kind of person who could afford long vacations, private outings, thoughtful anniversary trips. People believed him. For 20 years, people believed him. The trail Harold chose that day wasn't really a trail at all. It ran along Deer Mountain, in a section of the park with no marked path, poor cell reception, and no nearby ranger station. It was the kind of place you'd only find if you already knew exactly where you were going. And evidence would later show that Harold did know exactly where he was going. Investigators would find that he had been to this specific, obscure location before, more than once. Photographs recovered from the hike itself show the two of them earlier that day. Harold balanced on the rocks near the edge, smiling back at Toni as she took his photo. Another shows the two of them having lunch on the same outcropping, hours before her death. In the investigators' own case file, this spot would later be given a name. They called it the Fall Spot. Why had Harold been there before? What was he doing at an unmarked, hard-to-reach ledge on a mountain his wife had never visited? That question would take federal investigators, National Park Service rangers, and the FBI more than 2 years to answer. And when they finally did, it wouldn't just change how people understood Toni's death. It would reopen a case everyone thought was already closed: the death of another woman, 17 years before, under circumstances that suddenly looked disturbingly familiar. That's next. May of 1995. A stretch of Highway 67, about 10 miles west of a small town called Sedalia, Colorado. A car sits pulled off to the shoulder, and underneath it, working on a flat tire, is a woman named Sandra Lynn Henthorne. Her husband is nearby. There's no one else around for miles. No other cars. No witnesses. Just the two of them, on a quiet stretch of road, doing something as mundane as changing a tire. Something goes wrong. The car comes off the jack, and Lynn Henthorne is crushed beneath it. When authorities investigate, the story they're told is simple and, on its surface, entirely plausible. A jack failure. A tragic, freak accident. Within less than a week, Douglas County officials rule her death exactly that: an accident, nothing more. There's no reason, at the time, to look any harder. Accidents happen. People die in strange, senseless ways every day, and this is filed away as one of them. For 17 years, that's where it stays. Then, in October of 2012, just weeks after Tony Henthorn goes over a cliff in Rocky Mountain National Park, investigators quietly reopen the file on Lynn's death. They aren't doing this because of new physical evidence. They're doing it because of a pattern that's suddenly impossible to ignore. 2 wives, 2 remote locations, 2 moments where Harold Henthorn was the only person present when something went fatally wrong. And in both cases, a life insurance policy sitting in the background, timed in a way that raises more questions than it answers. But Lynn's death isn't the only incident investigators start re-examining. There's another one, closer to Tony's death, that starts to look different in hindsight. More than a year before the hike that killed her, Tony and Harold were working together on their mountain cabin. During that work, a 20-foot beam fell and struck Tony, fracturing her vertebrae. At the time, it was treated as exactly what it appeared to be. A construction accident, the kind of thing that happens on any job site when materials aren't secured properly. Prosecutor Sunita Hajra will later stand in front of a jury and describe this incident differently. She'll argue that Harold's account of how the beam fell doesn't hold together, that the explanation he gave doesn't match the physical reality of what would have needed to happen for it to fall the way he described. She frames it not as a random accident, but as a rehearsal, an earlier, failed attempt. Taken individually, none of these incidents proves anything. A tire change gone wrong, a beam that fell during cabin repairs, a hiking trip that ended in tragedy. Each one, on its own, could be exactly what it was called at the time it happened. But prosecutors don't want to present them individually. They want a jury to see all 3 side by side, and they have to convince a judge to let that happen. What follows is a 2-day hearing, one built entirely around a single question. Can evidence of 2 prior incidents be shown to a jury deciding whether Harold Henthorn murdered his second wife? 10 witnesses take the stand. Attorneys enter more than 30 exhibits into the record. Both sides argue their case for hours. The defense argues this is nothing more than an attempt to convict Harold based on character and suspicion, not evidence tied to what happened on that mountain in 2012. Painting him as the kind of man capable of this, they argue, isn't the same as proving he did it. Somewhere in Douglas County, a man named Rishal is watching all of this unfold. He's Lynn's brother. For 17 years, he believed his sister's death was exactly what everyone told him it was. An accident. Nothing more. Now, watching investigators lay out a case that connects her death to another woman's murder, he has to sit with the possibility that the answer had been sitting right in front of his family the entire time, and nobody had thought to ask the question. That's the part of this case that should stay with you. Not the courtroom drama, not the forensic details. It's the 17 years. 17 years where a pattern existed and nobody was looking for it, because nobody had any reason to believe there was a pattern at all. That's not a flaw in one investigation. That's how most of these cases stay buried. If something about how long warning signs can sit unnoticed unsettles you, that's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the exact gap our safety guide, invisible until it is not, was built to close. If you've ever wondered how someone gets chosen as a target, this case is a perfect example, and I go even deeper into it in my guide, linked below, or my description. Drop in the comments whether you think you'd have caught it. Would you have noticed the pattern? Or is this only obvious now, looking backward with all the pieces already on the table? The judge has heard both sides. Now there's only one question left. Will the jury ever hear about Lynn Henthorn at all? Early September 2015. Inside the Alfred J. Arridge United States Courthouse in Denver, about 50 prospective jurors sit waiting as Judge R. Brooke Jackson looks out at them and tells them plainly that the case they're about to hear will be, in his words, a doozy. Half of them have already heard about Harold Henthorn from the news. 3 are dismissed on the spot, unable to promise they can be impartial. The rest stay, and by the following Tuesday, opening statements begin. For the next several weeks, prosecutors lay out a case built almost entirely on circumstance. There's no confession, no eyewitness besides Harold himself. What there is, instead, is a mountain of documentation. More than 300 exhibits, phone records, photographs, the map with the pink highlighting and the X, testimony from rangers who walked the fall site and called it obscure, testimony about the beam, about Lynn, about insurance policies Tony never knew existed. In her closing argument, prosecutor Sunita Hajra tells the jury that Harold Henthorn scouted that remote stretch of Deer Mountain roughly 9 times before ever bringing Tony there. She argues he wasn't looking for a scenic view. He was looking for the perfect place to kill someone. Somewhere with no witnesses, no trail, and no chance that anyone could survive a fall from that height. The coroner who examined Toni's body takes the stand as well, and his testimony is its own kind of unsettling. He can't say, definitively, whether she fell or was pushed. There's no physical marker that proves murder beyond doubt. The entire case rests on whether 12 jurors believe that everything surrounding her death, the map, the money, the pattern, the timing adds up to something more than tragic coincidence. On September 21, 2015, after roughly 10.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returns its verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. At sentencing, Harold Henthorne stands before Judge Jackson and denies it. He says, plainly, that he did not kill Toni. The judge sentences him to life in prison anyway. Henthorne is eventually transferred to a high-security federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he remains today. He doesn't stop fighting the conviction. Over the following years, Henthorne takes his case to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that the evidence about Lynn and about the beam should never have been allowed in front of the jury in the first place. The appellate court disagrees, ruling that the evidence was properly admitted because it spoke directly to intent and planning, not just bad character. He takes it to the United States Supreme Court next, asking the nation's highest court to reconsider. The Supreme Court declines. His direct appeals end there. Still, Henthorne doesn't stop. He later argues, in a separate motion, that his own trial attorney failed him, that the man he paid more than $1 million to defend him was dishonest, and put his own financial interests above Henthorne's defense. A federal judge hears the claim and rejects it, finding that his representation at trial was constitutionally sound. Every avenue, at every level, has now been closed. Toni's brother, Todd Bertolet, says it plainly to reporters. The appeals on the merits have been made, and they've been denied and exhausted. What comes out over the course of this case is the picture of a man who spent 2 decades performing a version of himself that didn't exist. Henthorne told people he was a successful businessman, an entrepreneur, someone whose time was valuable and whose finances were solid. In reality, he hadn't held steady work since 1992. He lived, for years, off the insurance proceeds from Lynn's death, all while presenting an image to family, friends, and 2 wives that had almost nothing to do with the truth underneath it. And Lynn Henthorne's case remains open in the sense that matters most. No charges have ever been filed in her death. The man investigators believe killed her has spent the years since Toni's trial behind bars for one murder, while the first one sits unresolved, a case with no formal ending at all. That's the part of this story that should stay uncomfortable. Not the verdict, not the sentencing. The fact that one death got justice because investigators eventually connected it to a pattern, and the other is still waiting, 17 years later, for anyone to build a case at all. That gap between suspicion and proof is exactly where people get hurt the longest, and it's exactly why recognizing danger early, before there's a pattern to look back on, matters as much as it does. If that unresolved feeling sits with you, that's what Invisible Until It Is Not was built to help close. If you want the full breakdown, how targets are chosen, what your digital life reveals without you knowing, the script manipulators follow, and what to do in the first 60 minutes if something goes wrong, it's all in my guide. Links in the description and pinned comment. Tell us in the comments if you think Lynn's case should be formally reopened for charges after all this time, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. If you want to keep following cases like this one, where the truth took years to catch up to what happened, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The flashlights moved slowly across the dirt shoulder of a McAllen road, sweeping left, then right, then back again. It was the night of April 18, 1960, and dozens of volunteers had been walking this stretch for hours, boots crunching over gravel, calling a name into the dark that no one answered. Then one beam stopped, caught on something pale against the ground. A shoe. A single high-heeled shoe, resting alone in the dirt like it had simply fallen off mid-step. A few hundred yards further, someone else found a purse. Patent leather, snapped shut, sitting in the middle of an open field as if it had been set down and never picked back up. And not far from that, a lace veil, the kind a young woman might wear to church. No one said it out loud yet, but everyone searching that road that night was starting to understand the same terrible thing. Irene Garza was not coming home. 2 days earlier, on the evening of Saturday, April 16th, Irene had done something she'd done 100 times before. She borrowed her father's car, drove a few blocks from her family's home, and pulled up outside Sacred Heart Catholic Church in McAllen, Texas. It was Holy Saturday, the night before Easter, and Irene wanted to go to confession before the holiday. She was 25 years old, a second-grade teacher at Thigpen Elementary, the reigning Miss All South Texas sweetheart, a former homecoming queen at Pan American College. She was, by every account anyone ever gave of her, warm, faithful, and well-loved in a town that watched her grow up. She walked into that church a little before dark. She never walked back out. What almost nobody knew that night, what would only come out years later, in a courtroom, from a friend who'd heard it from Irene herself, was that this wasn't the first time something had felt slightly wrong at Sacred Heart. A friend of Irene's, a woman named Anna Maria Hollingsworth, would eventually testify that Irene had confided something odd to her. That the visiting priest hearing confessions that season, a young man named Father John Fite, had once pulled her out of the confessional booth entirely and asked her to give her confession somewhere else. Not in the booth, where a screen separates priest from parishioner. In the rectory. Alone. At the time, it was just a strange detail. A young woman mentioning something a little unusual about her priest to a friend over coffee. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody had a reason to. When Irene didn't come home that Saturday night, her parents didn't panic right away. They assumed she'd stayed for the Easter Vigil or gone to visit a friend. But as the hours slipped past midnight, worry took over, and by early Sunday morning they were at the McAllen Police Department, reporting their daughter missing. Her father's car was found parked near the church, exactly where she'd left it. For 2 days, the Garza family held on to a sliver of hope, and then that hope turned into something crueler. A woman called their home, claiming to be Irene. She said she'd been kidnapped, taken to a hotel across the border in Hidalgo, Texas. For a few unbearable hours, the family believed it. Then police discovered the call was a hoax. Someone, for reasons no one would ever fully explain, had decided to torment a grieving family with a lie. By then, what had started as a missing persons report had become something much larger. Volunteers poured in from across the Rio Grande Valley, neighbors, classmates, strangers who'd only heard Irene's name on the radio. It became, by every account, the largest search the region had ever seen. Men walked canal banks. Cars crawled down back roads. Churches organized prayer vigils while their own members combed the fields outside town. And then, on the night of April 18th, came the shoe, the purse, the veil, a trail of small, personal things scattered across several hundred yards of empty road, like breadcrumbs leading nowhere good. 3 more days passed. The search widened. Hope, which had been fragile from the start, grew thinner with every hour. On April 21st, 1965, days after Irene Garza walked into Sacred Heart Church for confession, her body was found. Not along a road, not in a field. She was floating in an irrigation canal on 2nd Street, what locals called Colonel Rose Street, less than a few miles from the church where she'd last been seen alive. The searchers who found her would never speak about that morning in much detail. Some things, they said, you don't describe. You just carry. What the coroner would find in the hours that followed what had actually been done to Irene Garza before she ended up in that canal was something the people of McAllen weren't prepared for. And neither, it would turn out, was the young priest who'd heard her final confession. By the time John Fite stood trial for what he'd done to Maria Guerra, more than a year had passed since she'd bitten his hand hard enough to draw blood inside that church in Edinburgh. The trial itself didn't even happen in Hidalgo County. It had been moved to Austin. A change of venue meant to give Fite a fairer shot at a jury that hadn't already read his name in every local paper for 18 months. In September of 1961, that Austin jury heard Maria Guerra describe, in her own words, what had happened to her. They heard from a witness who'd seen a man leaving the church that night. They heard everything investigators had built. And when it came time to reach a verdict, the jury deadlocked. Reports from inside that room would later suggest the split was 9-3. 9 jurors ready to convict, and 3 holding out. 9 votes is not a conviction. It's a hung jury, and a hung jury means the state has to decide whether it's worth doing all of this again. They chose not to. On March 28, 1962, John Fite walked into a courtroom one more time, and instead of facing a second trial, he entered a plea, no contest, to a reduced charge of aggravated assault. Not attempted rape. Not the crime Maria Guerra had described under oath. Aggravated assault. The penalty attached to it was a $500 fine. No jail time. No prison sentence. A man formally identified by 2 witnesses in connection with an attack disturbingly similar to the unsolved murder of Irene Garza walked out of that courtroom, having paid less than the cost of a used car. For decades, that's where the official record stopped. A quiet plea deal, a modest fine, and a case that simply faded. But years later, In a courtroom hundreds of miles and decades removed from that 1962 plea, a different story would come out. One that suggested the fine print of that deal went far beyond what anyone in Hidalgo County had been told at the time. A man named Daryl Davis had been a young television reporter back in 1962, covering the Guerra case for local news. Decades later, called to testify at Fite's eventual murder trial, Davis described something he said he'd carried for most of his career. He and a handful of other reporters, he testified, had been pulled into an off-the-record meeting with the district attorney at the time, a man named Robert Lattimore. And in that meeting, according to Davis, Lattimore told them plainly that both prosecutors and church officials already believed Fite had murdered Irene Garza. If Davis's account is accurate, and it's worth being clear that this is testimony given decades after the fact, not a contemporaneous record, then the lenient plea deal in the Guerra case wasn't really about the Guerra case at all. It was, according to what Davis says he was told, part of something larger, an arrangement in which Fite would avoid prosecution for Irene's murder entirely, in exchange for the church quietly removing him from Texas for good. Whether or not every detail of that account holds up exactly as told, one piece of it is not in dispute. There is a paper trail, and it says exactly what Davis remembered being told in that room. Investigators, decades later, subpoenaed records from Fite's religious order, and among those records was a letter, dated August 1, 1960, written by a priest named Father J.F. Palicki to his superior. In it, Palicki laid out a plan. Move Fite, the letter said, out of the area of suspicion. The letter didn't stop at protecting the church's reputation, either. It raised a concern that must have felt urgent to the men reading it at the time. Most of Hidalgo County's elected officials were Catholic, and that year, a Catholic senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy was running for president of the United States, in an election where his religion was already a national talking point. A scandal involving a priest and a murdered parishioner, the letter suggested, wasn't just a local embarrassment. It was a political liability that reached all the way to a presidential campaign. So the plan moved forward. In February of 1962, less than a month before his plea deal was even finalized in the Guerra case, John Fite was sent to New Melleray Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Dubuque, Iowa. A place of silence, literally. Trappist monks live under vows that include long stretches of no speech at all. It's hard to imagine a more effective way to disappear a man than sending him somewhere built around not talking. But Fite's story didn't end at the monastery walls. From there, he moved on to a treatment center for troubled priests in New Mexico, a facility meant to help clergy work through whatever crises had derailed their vocations. And at some point during his time there, Fite didn't just receive treatment. He became a supervisor. A man suspected by his own church of murder was eventually given a role helping to evaluate which priests were fit to return to parish work, fit to be placed back around families, back around children. One of the men Fite helped clear for continued ministry was a priest named James Porter. Porter would go on to become one of the most notorious sexual predators in the modern history of the Catholic Church, ultimately linked to the abuse of more than 100 victims before he was finally defrocked and sent to prison. Sit with that for a moment. A man the church itself suspected of murdering a 25-year-old schoolteacher was, years later, in a position of trust, helping decide who else got to wear the collar and walk back into a rectory. Fite eventually left the priesthood altogether in 1972. He married. He built an ordinary life for himself, the kind with a wife and eventually grandchildren, the kind most people assume is only available to men who haven't done anything to forfeit it. While all of that was happening, the Garza family in McAllen had exactly nothing. No conviction, no confession, no closure, just a daughter in the ground and a name they'd never stopped suspecting, living freely a few states away. If the fact that a suspected killer was handed authority over other priests, including one of the worst predators the church has ever produced, doesn't sit right with you, you're not alone, and it shouldn't. If you want to keep following exactly how far this went before anyone was finally held accountable, subscribe now, because what's coming next took over 40 years to happen, and it almost didn't happen at all. For 4 decades, the case of Irene Garza went cold in every official sense. No new leads, no new charges. The kind of case that gets filed away and mostly forgotten by everyone except the people who loved her. Then, in 2002, in McAllen, Texas, a police chief named Victor Rodriguez made a decision that no one in Hidalgo County had made in over 40 years. He decided to open the file again. Victor Rodriguez didn't reopen the Irene Garza case because new evidence had suddenly appeared. He reopened it because, after 4 decades, nobody in McAllen had ever really stopped believing the case deserved better than what it got. As police chief in 2002, Rodriguez brought in the Texas Rangers' newly formed cold case unit, and the man assigned to lead the investigation was a ranger named Rudy Jaramillo. Jaramillo inherited a file that was older than most of the people working it. Faded photographs, yellowed reports, a prime suspect who hadn't lived in Texas in 40 years. But cold cases don't stay buried because the truth disappears. They stay buried because the people who know the truth stop being asked. Jaramillo started asking again. And this time, someone finally answered. A man named Dale Tacheny came forward. Decades earlier, Tacheny had been a monk, living a life of near-total silence at Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri. And sometime around 1963, roughly 3 years after Irene Garza's murder, he says John Fite came to him and confessed to killing a woman. Tacheny would later testify that Fite didn't describe the moment with guilt or horror. He described it, according to Tacheny, almost flatly. Tacheny remembered Fite repeating what he said were Irene's last words to him, gasped out before she stopped fighting. "I cannot breathe. I cannot breathe." Tacheny had carried that confession in silence for close to 40 years before Ranger Jaramillo came asking questions in 2002. And he wasn't the only one willing to talk. Father Joseph O'Brien, the same priest who'd noticed the scratches on Fite's hand back in 1960, came forward too, corroborating that Fite had made a similar admission to him as well. For the first time since 1960, investigators had something they'd never had before. Not physical evidence, not a lineup identification, a confession described by 2 separate men, decades apart, both saying the same suspect had told them what he'd done. It still wasn't enough. Not yet. The district attorney at the time, a man named Rene Guerra, was reportedly reluctant to move forward, and it took sustained public pressure before he agreed to convene a grand jury in March of 2004. That grand jury met for 15 weeks. But the way those 15 weeks unfolded raised its own questions. Law enforcement testimony wasn't presented until the 11th week, and the 2 men whose accounts had reopened the entire case, Dale Tacheny and Father Joseph O'Brien, were never called to testify at all. The grand jury returned no indictment. For Irene's family, it was a second devastating collapse, decades after the first one. New evidence, new witnesses, a confession from the suspect's own mouth as described by 2 separate people, and still, nothing. It would take another decade and an election to move the case forward again. In 2014, a challenger named Ricardo Rodriguez ran for Hidalgo County District Attorney against the same Rene Guerra who'd let the 2004 grand jury slip away without an indictment. Rodriguez ran, in part, on a promise to take a serious look at the Garza case. He won. In February of 2016, that promise turned into an arrest. John Fite, 84 years old, was taken into custody at his home in Scottsdale, Arizona, and charged with the murder of Irene Garza. 56 years after she walked into Sacred Heart Church for confession, the man suspected from the very beginning was finally going to answer for it in a courtroom. The trial began in the fall of 2017 in the 92nd State District Court at the Hidalgo County Courthouse in Edinburgh, Texas, the same county where Irene had grown up and where her family had waited longer than most people wait for anything. Judge Louis, the clock reads 11:52 p.m. Grainy surveillance footage flickers to life above a bar door in a college town square. A young woman steps out into the warm July night. She's alone. Her head is down, eyes fixed on the glow of her phone screen, thumbs moving. She doesn't look up. She doesn't look around. Why would she? It's a Friday night in a town she knows, walking distance from a life she spent 3 years building. She has no idea that a camera bolted above a doorway is capturing the last moving images anyone will ever see of her alive. She gets into a car. The taillights pull away into the dark. And then, for the next several hours, she disappears from every camera, every record, every witness account that exists. What happened to her in that gap will end with 11 shell casings scattered across a dirt clearing beside a lake. A family in St. Louis, Missouri who will never hear her voice again. And a name that, 24 hours earlier, belonged to someone she trusted. This is the story of what happened to Ally Koschel. And I promise you, the person responsible is not who you think. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. If this is your first time here, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps us keep bringing these cases to light. And while you're settling in, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to where this really begins. Alexandria Koschel went by Ally. She was 21 years old, a marketing major heading into her senior year at the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, in Oxford, Mississippi. She was a sister in the Alpha Phi sorority, the kind of young woman friends described as warm, dependable, the one who'd show up for you without being asked twice. She'd grown up in St. Louis, Missouri, and by the summer of 2019, she was staying behind in Oxford rather than heading home, taking summer classes to stay on track for graduation and picking up extra hours teaching fitness classes on the side. She was, by every account, exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she'd planned. To understand what happened to her, we have to go back 3 years earlier, to the fall of 2016. That's when Ally first met Brandon Thiesfeld, a business student from Fort Worth, Texas, also enrolled at Ole Mississippi. What started between them was never officially a relationship, at least not in any way either of them would put a label on. Friends who knew them both describe it as on again, off again, the kind of connection that would flare up, cool down, and flare up again over the following 3 years. They were never boyfriend and girlfriend, not officially, but they kept finding their way back to each other. And people close to Ally would later describe the dynamic between them as complicated, at times rocky. Now fast forward to the spring of 2019, just months before Ally would die. On April 12th, Ally sent Brandon a message that would change the entire trajectory of both their lives. She told him she was worried she might be pregnant. 2 days later, on April 14th, she followed up with something more concrete, a photo of a home pregnancy test. The result was inconclusive. Not a clear yes, not a clear no, just enough uncertainty to demand a conversation neither of them was ready to have in person. Ally wanted to talk. She wanted to sit down with Brandon, face to face, and figure out what came next. But according to what prosecutors would later lay out in court, Brandon's response wasn't to show up. It was to pull away. He told her that becoming a father at this point in his life would ruin it. And then, for the better part of the next 3 months, he avoided being in the same room with her. Texts came in slowly, if at all. Plans to meet kept dissolving. Whatever was happening inside Brandon Thiesfeld during those months, he was keeping Ally, and everyone else, at arm's length. By July, the two of them were still communicating, still circling the same unresolved conversation, when Ally's summer took its final, ordinary turn. On the evening of July 19th, 2019, at around 7 o'clock, Ally called her mother, Cindy Koschel. It was a completely unremarkable conversation, the kind you have 100 times and never think to remember, until it becomes the last one. Ally mentioned she'd just woken up from a nap after sitting an exam that morning. She said she was planning to go out with friends later that night. Nothing about the call suggested anything was wrong. Nothing about it suggested it would be the final time Cindy Koschel would ever hear her daughter's voice. Later that night, Ally went out. She met up with friends around Oxford Square, the bar and restaurant strip that sits at the heart of the town, just off campus. It's the kind of place packed with Ole Miss students on any given weekend, loud, familiar, safe. Nothing about her night out was unusual. She wasn't alone in a strange place. She wasn't taking risks. She was exactly where thousands of other students her age would have been on a Friday night in July. And then, at 11:52 p.m., the surveillance camera above that bar door caught her walking out. Alone, looking down at her phone. She stepped into a rideshare vehicle and disappeared into the night, heading home. According to investigators, she made it back to her apartment safely. She was, as far as anyone could tell in that moment, fine. A young woman ending a normal night the way she'd started thousands of others. But somewhere out there, in the same town, on the same night, someone else was watching the clock too. At 12:46 a.m., in the early minutes of July 20th, a security camera captured a truck. It was moving in the direction of Ally's apartment complex. The vehicle matched a description investigators would later tie directly to Brandon Thiesfeld. Whatever happened between the moment Ally walked through her front door and the moment that truck appeared on camera outside her building, only 2 people will ever fully know. One of them isn't here to tell us. The other one didn't say much for a very long time. What we do know is this. By 1:45 in the morning, someone who knew Ally Koschel, someone she had a 3-year history with, someone who just months earlier had been told she might be carrying his child, was parked outside her home in the middle of the night. And Ally Koschel would never be seen alive again. That's where we're going to leave it for now. In our next chapter, we follow the drive that investigators would later reconstruct minute by minute, cell tower ping by cell tower ping, all the way out to a remote stretch of water 30 miles north of campus. where the truth about that night would finally start to surface. Stay with us for Chapter 2. Chapter 3 moves into the investigation itself, the digital evidence, the arrest, and the charge. Kept under 2,000 words, plain narrator voice, no formatting. When we left off, investigators in Lafayette County had a body, a timeline built from cell towers and security cameras, and a growing certainty that whoever was responsible for Ally Kostrzel's death was not a stranger. What they didn't have yet was proof solid enough to make an arrest stick. That proof was waiting for them inside Ally's own apartment, on a small device most people don't think twice about. Her Apple Watch. When detectives gained access to Ally's apartment in Oxford in the days following the discovery of her body, they weren't just looking for signs of a struggle or evidence of forced entry. They were looking for anything that could tell them who Ally had been in contact with in the final weeks and days of her life. And what they found on that watch, later corroborated through her phone records, was a long thread of text messages that laid bare exactly what had been building between Ally and Brandon Thiesfeld since April. The messages confirmed what investigators had already begun to suspect. Ally had told Brandon in April that she thought she might be pregnant. She'd sent him a photo of a test with an inconclusive result. She'd wanted to talk, in person, about what came next. And the responses coming back from Brandon, according to what was pulled from those threads, were not the responses of someone stepping up to a difficult conversation. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that he did not want a child, that becoming a father at this point in his life would ruin it. And rather than meeting with her to sort through the situation together, he pulled back. He avoided her calls. He let plans to see her in person quietly fall apart, week after week, for close to 3 months. But the Apple Watch and the phone records weren't the only digital trail investigators were now following. As the picture of Brandon Thiesfeld's state of mind in the months leading up to July began to take shape, so did something far more disturbing: his internet search history. According to what would later be laid out by prosecutors, Thiesfeld's search history in the weeks before Ally's death included queries about abortion options, something that lines up with his stated position that he wanted no part of fatherhood. But it didn't stop there. His search history also included queries about firearm silencers. And, perhaps most chilling of all, a search into how Ted Bundy, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, lured his victims. Around the same time, roughly a week before Ally was killed, Thiesfeld made a trip back to the Dallas, Texas area, near his hometown of Fort Worth. While there, he acquired a .40 caliber Glock handgun. And in a detail that still, even now, is difficult to fully process, he posted a photo of that gun on Twitter. The caption read, "Finally bringing my baby back home." Sit with that for a second. A young man, weeks removed from learning that the woman he'd been seeing for years believed she might be carrying his child, was purchasing a handgun and publicly joking about it using language that directly echoed the pregnancy he'd been avoiding discussing with her for months. Investigators would later point to this post, along with the search history, as evidence that whatever happened out at Sardis Lake on the night of July 19th into the early morning of July 20th was not some sudden, unplanned outburst. It was the culmination of weeks of decisions. With Ally's body found, the digital evidence mounting, and Thiesfeld's own location data placing him at the scene, investigators moved quickly. But there was a problem. Brandon Thiesfeld was nowhere to be found. In the hours and days following the discovery of Ally's body, Thiesfeld effectively vanished from the radar of anyone who knew him locally. He wasn't answering calls. He wasn't showing up to the places he was normally seen. For a young man who, just days earlier, had been an ordinary business student finishing out his time at Ole Miss, he had, in the eyes of investigators, gone on the run. Law enforcement issued a bulletin for his arrest and began tracking him the way modern investigations often do, through the digital footprint he couldn't fully erase. His cell phone activity and credit card usage gave them a trail to follow, and that trail led out of Mississippi entirely, north into Tennessee. On July 22, 2019, just 2 days after Ally's body was discovered, that trail brought investigators to a gas station in Memphis. There, officers located Brandon Thiesfeld and took him into custody. When they searched him and his vehicle, they found the .40 caliber Glock, the same model of weapon he'd posted about on social media days earlier. They also found clothing that appeared to have blood on it. Thiesfeld was formally arrested and transported back to Mississippi, where he was booked into custody in Lafayette County. In the search that followed, investigators executed a warrant at his apartment near campus. What they found there added another disturbing layer to a case that was already difficult to comprehend. A letter, handwritten, addressed to his parents. In it, Thiesfeld had written, "I am not a good person. It is not your fault." He went on to say, "I think this is the end for me. I'm going to prison or I'm going to die." It's worth pausing here to consider what that letter suggests. Written, based on its contents and the timeline investigators pieced together, around the same weekend Ally was killed, it reads less like the words of someone caught off guard by a sudden accusation, and more like someone who already knew, before anyone else did, exactly what he had done and exactly what was coming for him. In August of 2019, Brandon Thiesfeld was formally charged with capital murder in connection with the death of Ally Koschel. Capital murder is the most serious charge available under Mississippi law, and it carried with it the possibility of the death penalty. At his arraignment, he entered a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for what many in Oxford expected to become a lengthy, highly publicized trial. For Ally's family, back in St. Louis, the charge brought a strange kind of relief mixed with the beginning of an entirely new ordeal. Someone had been identified. Someone had been arrested. But the legal process that lay ahead of them, one that would ultimately stretch on for more than 2 years, was only just beginning. Between the formal charge and any resolution, there would be delays that no one could have predicted, court dates pushed back again, and a global pandemic that would bring the entire justice system to a crawl. We're going to leave things there for this chapter. Brandon Thiesfeld is behind bars, charged with capital murder, facing the possibility of the death penalty for what happened to Ally Koschel. But the case is far from over. In our final chapter, we're going to walk through what happened over those 2 years of legal delay, the psychiatric evaluation that would determine whether Thiesfeld was even fit to stand trial, and the moment, more than 2 years after Ally's death, when her family finally heard the words they'd been waiting for inside a Mississippi courtroom. If you want to see how this story finally comes to a close, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And if this chapter left you as unsettled as I think it did, drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps this case reach more people. I also want to know, down in the comments, what you make of that letter Brandon wrote to his parents before anyone even arrested him. Do you think he knew, from the very beginning, exactly what he'd done? We'll see you in the final chapter. With the new outline for the 4 chapter above, I want you to continue with the sequence of the story above, factoring every detail of a great true crime story into it. 2. Write in details on the next chapter. 3. Remove all bolded and clickable links text. 4. I want only the narrator's voice. 5. Allow it to be long without overlapping information from previous or future chapters. So start with chapter 4, and note that your results should here not PDF file, and it should be easy for copy and paste. The max word should be 2,000 word max for the chapter 4. Chapter 4 closes the story, the 2-year delay, the plea, sentencing, and where things stand today. Kept under 2,000 words, plain narrator voice. When we left off, Brandon Thiesfeld had been formally charged with capital murder, sitting in custody, facing the possibility of the death penalty for what happened to Ally Koschel at Sardis Lake. For Ally's family, an arrest had brought a name, a face, and a charge. What it hadn't brought was closure. That would take more than 2 years to arrive, and the road to get there was far longer and far more complicated than anyone expected in the summer of 2019. In the months following his arrest, Thiesfeld's case moved through the early stages of the legal process the way capital cases typically do, slowly, and with intense scrutiny, given what was at stake. His defense attorney, Tony Faries, began building a case that would eventually hinge not on denying the physical evidence, but on what came next in the legal process, whether Thiesfeld was even psychologically fit to stand trial at all. Then, in early 2020, the entire case, along with nearly every court proceeding across the country, ran into an obstacle nobody could have predicted. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the American justice system to a near standstill. Courtrooms closed. Trials were postponed indefinitely. For a case already carrying the weight of a possible death sentence, the pandemic added months, and eventually years, onto a process that Ally's family had to sit through from a distance, waiting for a resolution that kept receding further into the future. It was during this extended delay that Thiesfeld's legal team requested a formal psychiatric evaluation. In October of 2020, that evaluation was conducted. Its purpose was to determine 2 things: whether Thiesfeld had been legally sane at the time of the killing, and whether he was currently competent to stand trial. The findings, when they came back, offered no defense based on mental incapacity. The evaluation determined that Thiesfeld was both sane and mentally competent to stand trial, should the case proceed that far. With that question resolved, the case moved, slowly, toward its next phase. But a full capital trial never happened. Instead, nearly 2 years after Ally's death, Thiesfeld's defense team and the state of Mississippi reached an agreement. Thiesfeld would plead guilty. In exchange, the capital murder charge and the possibility of the death penalty that came with it would be taken off the table. He would instead plead guilty to first-degree murder. On Friday, August 27, 2021, that plea became official inside the Lafayette County Courthouse in Oxford, Mississippi, the same courthouse where Thiesfeld had first been arraigned more than 2 years earlier. Judge Kelly Luther presided over the hearing. In the courtroom that day was Assistant District Attorney Mickey Millett, who stood before the court and read aloud the full weight of the evidence the state had built against Thiesfeld, the timeline of the two phones traveling together towards Sardis Lake, the gunshots heard between 2:15 and 2:30 in the morning, the ballistics testing that matched bullets recovered from Ally's body directly to the Glock recovered from Thiesfeld at the time of his arrest, and the search history and social media posts that painted a picture of premeditation stretching back weeks before that night. As Millett read through the state's case, piece by piece, in open court, Brandon Thiesfeld sat and listened to the full accounting of what he had done, laid out publicly for the first time since his arrest. When it came time for Thiesfeld to speak, he turned to address Ally's family directly. He told them, "I am sincerely sorry for the pain I've caused while taking Ally from you. My actions have forever changed your lives and my family's lives. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't." Whatever weight those words carried, they were met, moments later, with a response from Ally's mother, Cindy Koschel, delivered in a written statement read aloud to the courtroom. She did not offer forgiveness. She told him plainly, "Brandon, you belong in jail each day for the rest of your life." Judge Kelly Luther accepted Thiesfeld's guilty plea to first-degree murder and handed down his sentence. Life in prison. Under Mississippi law, that sentence comes with the possibility of conditional release once Thiesfeld reaches the age of 65, meaning that even with a life sentence, the door to eventual release, decades from now, technically remains open. Brandon Thiesfeld is currently incarcerated at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Sunflower County, a facility more commonly known simply as Parchment. For more than 2 years, Ally Koschel's family had waited for a moment like this one, a formal acknowledgement, in a court of law, of exactly what happened to their daughter and who was responsible. What they got, in the end, was not a trial with a jury verdict, but a guilty plea that avoided the uncertainty and the additional years of delay that a full capital trial almost certainly would have brought. For some families in cases like this, a plea deal feels like an unsatisfying compromise. For others, it's the fastest available path to something resembling closure. Only the Koschel family can say which one it felt like for them. But what's clear from Cindy Koschel's words that day in court is that whatever peace this brought, it did not come with forgiveness, and it did not erase what those 2.5 years of waiting had cost them. In the years since the plea, the case has continued to draw attention well beyond Oxford, Mississippi. In March of 2022, CBS's long-running true crime program 48 Hours revisited Ally's story in an episode titled What Ally Koschel Didn't Know, reported by correspondent Michelle Miller. That episode walked through much of the same evidence we've covered across these 4 chapters: the Apple Watch text threads, the digital trail, the drive to Sardis Lake, and it gave Ally's family a platform to speak publicly about who she was, beyond the headlines and the court documents. As it stands today, there have been no further legal developments in this case. No appeal has been filed. No parole hearing is on the horizon, and given the terms of his sentence, none will be for a very long time. Brandon Thiesfeld remains where he was sent in August of 2021, and the case, from a legal standpoint, is closed. What stays with you, walking away from a case like this one, isn't really the forensic details, the cell tower data, or the ballistics reports, as important as they were to actually solving it. It's the 3 months between April and July of 2019. 3 months where 2 young people, who had known each other for years, who had built something between them even if neither would call it a relationship, faced a moment that demanded honesty and connection, and instead met it with silence, avoidance, and ultimately, something far beyond anything either of their families could have imagined. Ally Koschel wanted a conversation. That's all the evidence suggests she was ever asking for. A conversation, in person, with someone she trusted, about what came next for both of them. She never got it. What she got instead was a dark road out to a lake in the middle of the night, and a Saturday morning sunrise she never saw. If this case has stayed with you the way it stayed with us putting it together, That's exactly why we do what we do here on this channel. If you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next case we bring you, because there are far too many stories like Allies that deserve to be told with the same care and accuracy we've tried to bring to this one. Share this video with someone who you think needs to hear Allies' story, and drop a comment letting us know what you'll remember most about this case. We read every single one. Thank you for watching this one all the way through with us. We'll see you in the next case. It's 1:15 in the afternoon on a warm Friday in Corona del Mar, California. An 11-year-old girl is walking alone down a quiet residential street. She's just left summer school. She's got a homemade book bag slung over one shoulder, and she's still upset. You can see it if you look closely. A few minutes earlier, she was crying. A van pulls up beside her. It's turquoise. The back door is already open. A man is standing next to it. Two people driving by notice the moment. A young woman named Jandy and her mother. They don't think much of it. Not yet. Just a man, a van, a girl on the sidewalk. They keep driving. They have no way of knowing they just witnessed the last confirmed sighting of Linda and O'Keefe. By the next morning, an architect out for a bike ride with his 4-year-old son will be searching a drainage ditch for frogs. He will find something small and pale and still. What happened to Linda in between those two moments would go unanswered for almost 50 years. 2 DNA tests. 1 failed database search. A police department that never took her photo off the wall. And a break that would come not from a confession, not from a witness, but from a stranger's decision to spit into a plastic tube for a genealogy website, decades later, with no idea what it would unlock. This is that story. Welcome to XTC Uncovered. If this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. We've got viewers on every continent, and we genuinely love seeing where this community stretches to. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how Linda O'Keefe's case finally broke open, you first need to understand who she was, and exactly how ordinary, how devastatingly ordinary, the day she disappeared really was. Linda Ann O'Keefe was the middle child in a family of 5, growing up in the small beach community of Corona del Mar, a neighborhood within Newport Beach, California. She was quiet, gentle, the kind of child people remembered as sensitive long after she was gone. She loved painting. She loved crafts. She played piano, and she took the lessons seriously. She was a Girl Scout, and she loved animals. She'd recently lost her cat, and by her mother's account, she took the loss hard, the kind of hard that shows just how deeply she felt things. Her father, Richard, worked as a machinist. He and Linda were close, the kind of closeness that comes from shared quiet time rather than big gestures. Her mother, Barbara, was an artist and a working seamstress, and she made many of her children's clothes herself, including the dress Linda wore on the last day anyone saw her alive, a white dress patterned with light blue flowers and trimmed in dark blue. Her older sister, Cindy, would later describe Linda as a gentle, lovely soul, someone who always seemed to see the good in people, even when the world around her didn't always deserve it. On the morning of July 6, 1973, Linda got ready for another day of summer school. She normally rode her bicycle to Lincoln Intermediate School, just a short trip through the neighborhood streets of Corona del Mar. But that morning, her routine changed. Her piano teacher offered her a ride, and Linda took it. It seemed like a small, unremarkable shift. In hindsight, it would turn out to matter more than anyone could have imagined, because it meant that when the school day ended, Linda didn't have her bike. She had no way to get home except to walk or to be picked up. So she did what any 11-year-old would do. She went to the school office, and she called her mother. Barbara picked up. She was busy, caught up in the demands of the day, the kind of ordinary busyness that never feels significant until later, when it's the last decision replayed 1,000 times. She told Linda she couldn't come get her. She told her to walk home instead. It wasn't a cruel decision. It wasn't even an unusual one. Kids walked home from school every day in 1973, in a quiet beach town where nothing like this had ever happened. But Linda didn't take it well. She was upset. She hung up the phone, and instead of leaving right away, she sat down on the curb outside the school office. She sat there for a while, crying, working through the disappointment the way kids do, alone, in that small private grief that adults rarely see. Eventually, she stood up, and she started walking. The route home would have taken her through familiar streets, sidewalks she'd walked 100 times, past houses she recognized, in a town small enough that most people knew their neighbors by name. Corona del Mar, in 1973, was the kind of place where a child walking home alone raised no alarm at all. It was safe. Or at least, it was assumed to be. At around 1:15 in the afternoon, less than an hour after that phone call, Linda reached the intersection of Marguerite Avenue and Inlet Drive. That's where Jandy and her mother saw her. That's where the turquoise van was parked. That's where a man stood beside it, the back door open, close enough to Linda that the two witnesses driving past would remember the scene clearly enough to describe it to investigators decades later. The color of the van, the position of the man, the fact that the door was already open, as if it had been open and waiting. Neither Jandy nor her mother stopped. There was nothing that looked like a struggle, nothing that looked like danger. Just a girl, a van, a man, a moment that could have been anything. A moment that, to two strangers passing by in a car, didn't seem worth a second glance. It would be the last time Linda and O'Keefe was ever seen alive. Hours passed. Somewhere in Corona del Mar, evening set in the way it does on a July day near the coast. Long light, cooling air, the ordinary rhythm of a neighborhood winding down. But Linda didn't come home. And as the hours stretched past what should have been a short walk, worry in the O'Keefe household turned into something sharper. At 6:42 that evening, a call came into the Newport Beach Police Department from a house on Orchid Avenue. Linda and O'Keefe was missing. What followed was not the delayed, uncertain response that so many cold cases begin with. This community moved fast. Officers fanned out almost immediately. They searched the vacant fields south of Pacific View and east of Marguerite, open lots that, in 1973, still dotted that part of Newport Beach before later development filled them in. They searched the reservoir. They walked the neighborhood streets, checked yards, checked the places an 11-year-old girl might have wandered off to on her own. Patrol cars combed the roads. As night fell and the search widened, officers moved into Fashion Island and toward the edges of the Back Bay, first on foot, then by car, then, as the search intensified, by helicopter, sweeping light across terrain that patrol cars simply couldn't reach. Jeeps pushed into the rougher areas along the water where regular vehicles couldn't follow. They searched through the entire night, and they found nothing. Somewhere out there, in the dark, along a stretch of nature trail most of Corona del Mar barely thought about, something had already happened that no searchlight was going to undo. But nobody searching that night knew that yet. All they had was a missing 11-year-old girl, a community that had never faced anything like this before, and a search that would carry on past midnight and into the early hours of the next morning, with no answers in sight. By the time the sun came up over Newport Beach on July 7th, Linda O'Keefe had been missing for almost 12 hours. What happened next? What a local architect would find while riding his bike with his young son that morning, and everything the investigation would uncover in the decades that followed. That's where we pick up next. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how a single moment like this one, caught by two strangers driving past in a car, ends up cracking a case wide open nearly 50 years later, hit subscribe right now. This channel exists for cases exactly like Linda's, and there's a lot more of her story still to tell. Deliberated narrative structure and chapter continuity strategy. Deliberated narrative structure and chapter continuity strategy. Cold Case Corona del Mar. Chapter 3, Linda's story. For most of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Linda O'Keefe's case existed in a kind of suspended state. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but frozen. Investigators had evidence. They had a physical description from witnesses. They had the account of a turquoise van and a man standing beside it at the corner of Marguerite and Inlet. What they didn't have was a way to turn any of it into a name. That began to change, slowly, in the late 1990s, when a criminalist working the case took swabs preserved from the original investigation and ran the first DNA test the technology of the era allowed. It produced something significant, an unknown male genetic profile, pulled directly from evidence connected to Linda's murder. For the first time since 1973, investigators had something concrete tying a specific, individual human being to the crime. They just didn't know who he was. In 2001, that profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, the system law enforcement agencies across the country use to check unknown crime scene DNA against the profiles of convicted offenders already on file. It was, at the time, the best tool available for closing exactly this kind of gap. Investigators ran the search, and they waited. There was no match. Whoever had left that DNA behind in 1973 had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to land his profile in the system. He wasn't in CODIS. He wasn't going to be found that way. And so, once again, the case settled back into silence. Not because anyone had stopped caring, but because the technology of the moment had reached its limit. That limit wouldn't hold forever. By the mid-2010s, forensic science had moved into territory that would have sounded like science fiction to the detectives working Linda's case in 1973. A field called forensic genetic genealogy was beginning to take shape. The idea that you could take an unknown suspect's DNA, not just check it against a database of criminals, but compare it against the millions of ordinary people who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to consumer genealogy websites, hoping to learn about their ancestry, build out a family tree, or connect with long-lost relatives. None of those people were criminals. None of them had any idea their spit-in-a-tube ancestry kit might one day help solve someone else's murder. But the science didn't need the suspect himself in the system. It just needed a distant cousin. In October of 2017, Newport Beach Sergeant Court Deepweg made a decision that would ultimately reopen the entire case. He brought in a company called Parabon Nanolabs and asked them to do something with the DNA evidence that had sat, unmatched, since 2001. Parabon specialized in a technique called DNA phenotyping, essentially reading physical traits directly out of genetic material. Not just identity, appearance, ancestry, skin tone, eye color, hair color, the presence or absence of freckles. From decades-old evidence, Parabon built something investigators had never had before in this case, an actual face. A composite image of what their unknown suspect likely looked like. A Caucasian male, built entirely from the genetic fingerprint he'd left behind in 1973. It was a breakthrough, but a composite image alone doesn't solve a case. It gives investigators a face to look for. It doesn't give them a name. Around the same time, something else was quietly happening, separate from the lab work, separate from the department entirely. One of Linda's former classmates came across a Facebook post about a different cold case, a different family, a different decades-old tragedy that had recently been solved using this same kind of DNA technology. Reading it, something clicked. If a case like that could be solved after all these years, why not Linda's? That single Facebook post set off a chain reaction. Former classmates who had grown up, moved on with their lives, built careers and families of their own. Women like Terry Briscoe Corwin and Lisa Christopher, who had once been 11-year-old girls riding their bikes around the neighborhood in the desperate days after Linda's murder, found each other again. They formed a Facebook group. They called it Justice for Linda and O'Keefe. And they didn't just post about it online. They showed up, in person, at the Newport Beach Police Department, walking up to the counter and telling the officer on duty that they wanted to talk about a case from 1973. They had no idea, walking in, that they didn't need to convince anyone the case still mattered. Linda's photograph had been on the wall inside that department the entire time. The classmates who thought they were the ones keeping her memory alive discovered that the department had never let it go either. Two separate efforts, one from the people who loved her, one from the officers who'd inherited her case, had been running in parallel for years, neither fully aware of how far the other had come. That convergence gave Sergeant Deepweg and the department spokesperson, Jennifer Manzella, an idea. The Parabon composite existed. The public hadn't seen it yet. On July 6, 2018, the 45th anniversary of Linda's disappearance was approaching. Manzella had seen another agency, in Canada, try something unconventional on a cold case anniversary, telling the victim's story in the first person, in real time, through social media. She thought Newport Beach could do the same thing for Linda. What they built was called Linda's Story, told across 68 tweets over the course of the anniversary, written entirely from Linda's own point of view. It opened simply, "Hi, I'm Linda O'Keefe, or Linda and O'Keefe, if I'm in trouble with my mom. 45 years ago today, I disappeared from Newport Beach. I was murdered, and my body was found in the Back Bay. My killer was never found. Today, I'm going to tell you my story." From there, the thread walked through the events of July 6, 1973, almost exactly as they happened, time to the hour. The phone call to her mother. The walk home. The turquoise van at Marguerite and Inlet. The 6:42 p.m. call from Orchid Avenue, reporting her missing. The overnight search through the fields and the reservoir and the Back Bay. And finally, the tweet describing what Ron Yeo saw that next morning along Back Bay Drive. A man looking in the ditch on the east side of the road, searching for frogs in the cattails, instead finding something small and pale. It was an unusual, almost uncomfortable way for a police department to communicate. And it worked, in a way almost nobody expected. The thread reached across the entire world. By the department's own count, it generated roughly 7 million impressions, shared and read not just across the United States, but in South America, across Europe, in Australia, and France. For a moment, an 11-year-old girl's murder from 1973 was being discussed by strangers on every continent. At the very end of the thread, Newport Beach police released the Parabon composite publicly for the first time. A face, built from DNA, shown to millions of people who had never heard Linda's name before that week. And alongside it, a question the department had been asking internally for months, now asked of the entire internet. What is his name? The Twitter campaign didn't produce an immediate arrest. No single tip led directly to a name in the days that followed. But it did something almost as important. It kept the case alive in the public consciousness at a moment when the science was finally catching up to what investigators needed. It kept pressure on. It kept Linda's story circulating at exactly the moment when a very different kind of breakthrough was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. Because while the public had been introduced to a composite face, investigators working with genetic genealogist Cece Moore, still with Parabon, were taking the original DNA profile and running it against the same kind of consumer genealogy databases that ordinary people use to build family trees. They weren't looking for the suspect directly. They were looking for his relatives, distant cousins who had no connection to the crime at all, who had simply spit into a tube one day out of curiosity about where their family came from. In January of 2019, that search returned something. Not the suspect's own profile in a database. A genetic connection. A pointer built from partial matches to people who shared his DNA without ever knowing why it mattered. For investigators who had waited 18 years since the failed Cody's search and 46 years since Linda's murder, it was the first real thread leading toward an actual name. They pulled on it. And for the first time since July of 1973, it didn't lead nowhere. This is genuinely one of the things I love most about true crime cases like this one. It wasn't just the police who kept Linda's case alive. It was her own classmates, refusing to let her be forgotten, walking into a police station decades later to ask questions nobody else was asking. If that kind of persistence means something to you too, hit subscribe. It tells me to keep finding and telling stories like hers. And if you're still with me at this point, drop a comment with one word, justice. I read every single one of them. What that DNA lead uncovered, and the man it finally led investigators to, is where we go next. Parse and analyze this story. Start with the media res. I want the hook to leave viewers in suspense. The target is to keep them watching as they want to know more about the case. So they try to watch the other part of the case. After the suspense, tell them welcome to XTC Uncovered. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. With the new outline for the 4-chapter above, I want you to continue with the sequence of the story above, factoring every detail of a great true crime story into it. 2. Write in details on the next chapter. 3. Remove all bolded and clickable links text. 4. I want only the narrator's voice. 5. Allow it to be long without overlapping information from previous or future chapters. So start with Chapter 4, and note that your results should here not PDF file, and it should be easy for copy and paste. The max word should be 2,000 word max for the Chapter 4. Cold Case Corona Del Mar. Chapter 4, James Allen Neal. The DNA lead investigators pulled in January of 2019 didn't hand them a name outright. It handed them a family tree, distant relatives, genetic fragments, a web of connections that had to be worked backward, generation by generation, the same painstaking process genealogists had used to crack other cold cases in the years before. But this time, the tree eventually narrowed down to a single branch, and at the end of that branch was a man living quietly in Colorado Springs, Colorado, going by the name James Allen Neal. He was 72 years old. He had spent decades building a life far from Newport Beach, far from the case that had never stopped being investigated in his absence. What investigators discovered as they dug deeper was that the man now known as James Allen Neal hadn't always gone by that name. In 1973, at the time Linda O'Keefe was murdered, he was living under a different identity entirely, James Allen George Layton. At some point after the murder, he left California, relocated to Florida, and legally changed his name. He rebuilt himself, in effect, as someone else, a new name, a new state, a new life laid down on top of whatever had happened in Corona Del Mar in July of 1973. A genetic pointer was enough to bring investigators to his door, but it wasn't enough, on its own, to make an arrest. Detectives needed to directly confirm that Neal's own DNA matched the profile taken from the crime scene decades earlier. So they watched him. They waited for an opportunity to legally obtain a sample of his DNA without alerting him to what was happening. A discreet, careful process that authorities have never fully detailed publicly, only confirming that it worked. It did. The DNA recovered from Neil matched the profile that had sat unmatched in evidence since the 1990s, unmatched in Cody's since 2001, and unidentified through nearly 46 years of investigation. On the morning of February 19, 2019, at around 6:30, law enforcement arrested James Allen Neal in Colorado Springs. The following day, February 20th, Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis and Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer stood together at a press conference in Santa Ana to announce what investigators had spent nearly half a century working toward. A suspect, a name, a face that matched not just the Parabon composite the public had seen the year before, but the actual man responsible. Spitzer didn't mince words about what the case had taken to get to this point. The pursuit of justice, he said, is never-ending. And in this case, the hunt for a child rapist and murderer had lasted more than 46 years, spanning generations of law enforcement officers who had inherited Linda's case file, inherited her photograph on the department wall, and carried the responsibility forward without ever seeing it resolved. Neal was extradited from Colorado to Southern California in the days following his arrest and booked into custody in Orange County. His first court appearance took place in a jail courtroom in Santa Ana, where his arraignment was postponed to March 29, 1973. March 29, 2019, giving both sides time to prepare for what prosecutors were now formally charging him with. The charges were severe. Murder, with a special circumstance allegation tied to the commission of lewd acts on a child under the age of 14. 5 separate felony counts of lewd or lascivious acts on a child under 14. And a sentencing enhancement allegation reflecting multiple victims, because Neal, it turned out, was not a one-time offender who had simply never been caught. If convicted on all charges, he faced a maximum sentence of 82 years to life in prison. Spitzer's office initially looked into whether the death penalty was legally available in this case. Ultimately, prosecutors determined it was not. That phrase, multiple victims, was not a formality in the charging documents. It was the direct result of what investigators uncovered once they identified Neal as their suspect. Tracing his history after 1973 led detectives to 2 other cases, this time in Riverside County, involving 2 young girls who had been sexually assaulted sometime between the 1990s and the early 2000s. These were not cases that had gone completely undetected. They existed in some form in the record, but it was the identification of Neal in the O'Keefe case that allowed investigators to connect him directly to those assaults as well. A man who had evaded justice for Linda's murder in 1973 had, in the decades that followed, gone on to harm at least 2 more children before finally being stopped. For Linda's family, for her parents, for her sister Cindy, for the friends who had spent their own childhoods riding bikes around the neighborhood trying to help find her killer, for the classmates who decades later walked into a police station and asked someone to finally listen. The arrest was the moment they had waited almost their entire lives for. 46 years is not an abstract number. It's a childhood, an adulthood, an entire life lived alongside an unanswered question. And now, finally, there was a name attached to it. A face. A man in custody, awaiting trial, facing the consequences of what he'd done. But this story does not end with a courtroom, and it does not end with a verdict. Neal remained in custody at the Theo Lacey facility in Orange, California, as the case moved through the pretrial process. Depositions, motions, all the slow procedural machinery that stands between an arrest and an actual trial. That process takes time under the best of circumstances. Neal was 73 years old. On May 25, 2020, Neal was taken from Theo Lacey to a nearby hospital, suffering from an undisclosed illness. Officials were careful to clarify, at the height of a global pandemic when every hospitalization drew immediate suspicion, that his condition was not related to COVID-19. Whatever was affecting him, it was serious enough to require hospital care, and serious enough that it would not be something he recovered from. On July 22, 2020, at approximately 5:15 in the morning, James Allen Neal died in custody. He never stood trial. He never had to answer, in a courtroom, in front of Linda's family, for what he did to her in 1973, or for what he did to 2 more children in the years that followed. The case that had taken 46 years to identify him ended, in the final measure, without the one thing everyone involved had spent decades working toward: a verdict, spoken out loud, in a room where Linda's family could hear it. District Attorney Todd Spitzer addressed the death directly, and he didn't soften what it meant. The pursuit of justice, he said again, is never-ending. And in this case, the hunt for a child rapist and murderer lasted more than 46 years and transcended generations of law enforcement officers. Neil's death before trial, he said, robbed the O'Keefe family of the justice they so deeply deserved, and it deprived every officer who had ever worked this case of the satisfaction of finally seeing it through to the end. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis echoed the same sentiment, saying it had been the department's full intention to see James Allen Neal stand trial and answer, in open court, for the murder of Linda and O'Keefe. He never did. What Linda's case ultimately left behind isn't a tidy resolution. It's something more complicated than that. It's confirmation, finally, after 46 years, of who took her life. It's accountability, in the sense that his identity is now permanently, publicly attached to what he did, and can never again hide behind a changed name in a different state. It's the 2 additional victims in Riverside County who, because of this investigation, saw their own cases connected to the man responsible, decades after their own assaults. And it's a reminder, both devastating and important, of exactly how far modern science has come since 1973, how a piece of preserved evidence, sitting untouched through failed database searches and shifting technology for nearly half a century, could still, eventually, tell investigators exactly who they were looking for. Linda Ann O'Keefe was 11 years old. She loved painting and piano and the beach, and she saw the good in people, even in a world that, for her, turned out to hold something unspeakably cruel. Her case took 46 years to solve, and even then, the ending isn't the one anyone wanted. But her name is known. Her story was told, not by strangers speculating about what might have happened, but in her own voice, reaching millions of people who never knew her, and who will not forget her now. If this case affected you the way it affected us researching it, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe, because we cover cases like Linda's every single week, and every one of them deserves to be remembered the same way. If you want to see more cold cases finally get the resolution, or in some cases, the complicated, incomplete resolution that Linda's did, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Cases like Linda's stay solved because people keep talking about them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.